In the dense forest that stretched endlessly beyond the Rhine's eastern banks, where Roman eagles had never permanently roosted, and where the morning mist clung to ancient oak groves like ancestral spirits, a child was born who would reshape the trajectory of imperial ambition. Around 18 to 16 BC, during the reign of Augustus, when Rome's expansion seemed as inevitable as the changing seasons, Arminius drew his first breath in a world balanced precariously between tradition and transformation. The Cherusci, into whose noble lineage Arminius was born, occupied a position of considerable influence among the sprawling Germanic tribal confederation that dominated the territories between the Rhine and Elbe rivers. Their settlements clustered along the fertile river valleys of what modern geography would recognise as Lower Saxony and Westphalia, where the soil proved rich enough to support both agriculture and the large populations necessary for military dominance. The Cheruscan heartland encompassed roughly 40,000 square kilometres of mixed terrain, dense woodlands interspersed with cleared agricultural plots, meandering rivers that served as both transportation arteries and defensive barriers, and elevated ridges that provided strategic vantage points for monitoring tribal movements and potential threats. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites across Cheruscan territory reveals a society far more sophisticated than Roman propaganda typically acknowledged. Their villages, while lacking the stone architecture that Romans associated with civilization, demonstrated careful urban planning with designated areas for metalworking, pottery production, and livestock management. The largest settlements could house upwards of 2,000 inhabitants, with the chieftain's compound occupying elevated ground and featuring timber halls capable of accommodating several hundred warriors during important gatherings. The Cherusci maintained their prominence through a complex web of alliances, tribute relationships, and military partnerships that extended their influence far beyond their immediate territorial boundaries. To their north, they maintained generally cordial relations with the Chauci, whose control of coastal regions provided access to amber trade routes and naval capabilities. Eastward, their influence reached toward the Semnones, acknowledged by many Germanic tribes as the most ancient and therefore most prestigious of their confederation. The Cherusci served as intermediaries in disputes between smaller tribes, collected tribute from subordinate groups, and could field armies numbering in the tens of thousands when circumstances demanded unified action. Within this confederation structure, the Cherusci operated under what Roman observers described as a limited monarchy, though this characterization oversimplified their actual governance system. Leadership rotated between several prominent families, with succession determined through a combination of hereditary claims, demonstrated military prowess, and approval from the tribal assembly. Chiefs held authority over military matters and external relations, but significant decisions required consultation with a council of senior warriors and landowners. This system created a balance between centralized leadership necessary for military coordination and the fierce independence that Germanic culture prized above almost all other virtues. Arminius's father, whose name Roman sources record as Segima, held substantial influence within this political framework. As a member of the Cheruscan nobility, Segima commanded his own retinue of warriors, controlled extensive agricultural lands worked by both free farmers and enslaved captives from tribal conflicts, and participated in the deliberations that shaped Cheruscan policy towards neighbouring tribes and the encroaching Roman presence. The family's status provided young Arminius with access to the finest weapons training, exposure to diplomatic negotiations, and most importantly, the expectation that he would eventually assume leadership responsibilities within the tribe. Germanic society during this period operated according to principles that differed fundamentally from Roman concepts of citizenship and social organization. Status derived primarily from military achievement and personal loyalty relationships, rather than wealth accumulation or administrative position. Warriors bound themselves to chiefs through sacred oaths that created mutual obligations extending beyond simple military service. A chief provided weapons, armour, horses and opportunities for glory in exchange for absolute loyalty, while warriors gained social standing through their association with successful leaders and their own battlefield accomplishments. This warrior culture permeated every aspect of Germanic childhood education. Boys began weapons training as soon as they could hold wooden practice swords, learning not just combat techniques, but the intricate codes of honour that governed warrior behaviour. They memorised genealogies stretching back generations, studying the deeds of ancestors whose reputations for courage or wisdom established family standing within the tribe. Hunting expeditions served as practical education in tracking, woodcraft and group coordination, while reinforcing the connection between human society and the natural world that Germanic religion emphasised. Religious beliefs among the Cherusci centred on a pantheon of deities who embodied natural forces and warrior virtues. Woden, the one-eyed god of war and wisdom, commanded particular reverence among the nobility for his association with battle, fury and poetic inspiration. Donar, the thunder god, protected communities from supernatural threats and blessed agricultural endeavours with favourable weather. Tiayu, the sky god associated with justice and oaths, oversaw the sacred commitments that bound warriors to their chiefs and tribes to their allies. These deities demanded regular sacrifices, livestock during seasonal festivals, precious weapons thrown into sacred groves, and in extraordinary circumstances, human offerings to secure divine favour for crucial military campaigns. Sacred groves served as the primary centres for religious observance, with ancient trees marking sites where the boundary between human and divine worlds grew thin. The Cherusci maintained several such locations within their territory, including a massive oak grove where tribal assemblies gathered during important festivals, and where priests interpreted omens by examining the flight patterns of sacred birds or the arrangement of wooden lots cast upon white cloth. These ceremonies reinforced tribal identity while connecting current generations to ancestral traditions that stretch back to the mythical origins of the Germanic peoples. The cultural emphasis on personal honour created a society where reputation mattered more than material possessions. A warrior who fled from battle brought shame not only upon himself, but upon his family lineage, while acts of exceptional courage could elevate even relatively humble individuals to positions of respect and influence. This honour culture encouraged aggressive behaviour toward outsiders, while demanding absolute loyalty within the tribal group. Young men competed constantly to demonstrate their worthiness through hunting prowess, skill with weapons, and eloquence in formal speeches that displayed both intelligence and commitment to tribal values. Germanic legal traditions relied heavily on compensation payments, rather than physical punishment for most offences. Complex schedules determined appropriate payments for various injuries or insults, with amounts varying according to the social status of both victim and perpetrator. Murder could be resolved through payment of wergild to the victim's family, though particularly heinous crimes might result in outlawry, expulsion from tribal protection that essentially amounted to a death sentence in a world where survival depended on group membership. This system emphasised restoration of social harmony rather than retribution, though it also reinforced existing hierarchies by assigning different values to different lives. During Arminius's childhood, the geopolitical situation along the Rhine frontier grew increasingly tense as Roman expansion pressed steadily eastward. Augustus had consolidated control over Gaul during the previous generation, establishing a secure base for further operations while simultaneously creating a lengthy border that required constant military attention. Roman merchants had already penetrated Germanic territories, establishing trading relationships that introduced Mediterranean goods while gathering intelligence about tribal political structures and military capabilities. The Romans approached Germanic relations with characteristic pragmatism, employing a combination of military pressure, diplomatic manipulation, and economic incentives to advance their strategic objectives. They identified ambitious tribal leaders who might be persuaded to accept Roman alliance, offering them military support against traditional enemies in exchange for acknowledgement of Roman suzerainty. This policy proved particularly effective with smaller tribes seeking protection from more powerful neighbours, but it also created resentment among established leaders who viewed Roman interference as a threat to traditional authority structures. Roman military camps along the Rhine served as bases for reconnaissance expeditions that probed Germanic defences while demonstrating Roman technological superiority. Germanic warriors had encountered Roman legions during conflicts in Gaul and understood the disciplined effectiveness of professional soldiers equipped with standardized weapons and armour. However, they also recognized that Roman military doctrine depended heavily on open-field engagements where superior organization and equipment could prove decisive. The dense forests and marshy terrain of Germanic territory offered opportunities for the kind of guerrilla warfare that had proven effective against Roman forces in other frontier regions. Trade relationships complicated the political situation by creating economic dependencies that could be exploited by either side. Germanic tribes valued Roman manufactured goods, particularly metal tools, weapons, and luxury items, but they also needed to maintain access to these products without compromising their political independence. Roman merchants served as unofficial ambassadors, reporting on tribal politics while establishing the personal relationships that might prove useful during future diplomatic negotiations or military campaigns. The Cherusci found themselves particularly exposed to Roman influence due to their geographic position and their role as intermediaries between other Germanic tribes. Their territory lay directly across the Rhine from established Roman bases, making them obvious targets for Roman diplomatic overtures, while simultaneously making them vulnerable to military pressure if negotiations failed. Their confederation leadership role meant that Roman success in manipulating Cheruscan policy could potentially influence the behaviour of numerous smaller tribes throughout the region. Within this complex environment, young Arminius received an education that prepared him for leadership in a world where traditional Germanic values increasingly confronted Roman power and influence. He learned to read the subtle signs that indicated shifting tribal loyalties, to assess the military capabilities of potential allies and enemies, and to navigate the intricate web of kinship obligations and personal honour that governed Germanic political relationships. His training emphasised adaptability and cunning alongside the martial prowess that Germanic culture traditionally prized, preparing him for challenges that would require both military skill and diplomatic sophistication. The weapons training that formed a central component of his education reflected the evolving nature of Germanic warfare. Traditional emphasis on individual combat prowess remained important, but tribal military leaders increasingly recognized the need for coordinated tactics that could counter Roman organizational advantages. Young warriors learned to fight effectively in dense forest conditions, where Roman formations lost much of their effectiveness, while also mastering the cavalry techniques that allowed Germanic forces to exploit their superior mobility and knowledge of local terrain. The transition from Cheruscan prince to Roman hostage occurred through mechanisms as old as Mediterranean diplomacy itself. Around 4 AD, when Augustus had consolidated his vision of imperial expansion beyond the Rhine, the foedus system, Rome's time-tested method of managing frontier relationships reached into the Germanic heartlands with unprecedented scope. This treaty framework, which had previously bound Celtic chieftains and Iberian nobles to Roman interests, now extended its influence across the Rhine to encompass the most powerful Germanic confederation leaders, including Segima and his family. The foedus agreements represented far more than simple military alliances. These carefully crafted documents established hierarchical relationships that acknowledged Roman supremacy while preserving the dignity of tribal leadership structures. Germanic chiefs who entered into such arrangements retained authority over internal tribal affairs, continued to collect traditional tributes from subordinate groups, and maintained their ceremonial roles in religious observances. In exchange, they accepted obligations to provide military assistance when requested, granted Roman merchants favourable trading terms, and most significantly for families like Arminius's, surrendered high-ranking family members as guarantees of continued cooperation. Roman diplomatic protocol required these hostages to be treated with honour befitting their noble status, but their presence in Rome served multiple strategic purposes beyond simple treaty enforcement. Young Germanic nobles provided Romans with detailed intelligence about tribal political dynamics, military capabilities, and potential vulnerabilities that could prove crucial during future campaigns. Their education in Roman institutions created a cadre of leaders who understood imperial administrative methods and military doctrine, theoretically making them more effective partners in Roman expansion efforts. Most importantly, their prolonged exposure to Roman civilization was intended to create psychological bonds that would ensure their loyalty even after their eventual return to Germanic territories. The journey to Rome itself represented a profound cultural shock for young Arminius. The overland route from Cheruscan territory followed established military roads that demonstrated Roman engineering capabilities on a scale that Germanic construction techniques could not match. Stone bridges spanned rivers that Germanic tribes typically forded or crossed, using temporary wooden structures. Milestone markers indicated precise distances between settlements, reflecting a systematic approach to territorial organisation that contrasted sharply with the more fluid boundary concepts prevalent in Germanic society. Way stations provided regular opportunities for rest and resupply, supported by administrative networks that could coordinate logistics across hundreds of kilometres with remarkable efficiency. Roman cities encountered during the journey displayed urban planning principles entirely foreign to Germanic experience. Aquae Mattiacorum, the thermal spring settlement that would later become Wiesbaden, showcased Roman hydraulic engineering through its sophisticated bath complexes and water distribution systems. Mogontiacum, the massive legionary fortress overlooking the Rhine confluence, demonstrated the scale of Roman military installations with its stone walls, organised barracks blocks, and extensive storage facilities capable of supporting entire legions through extended campaigns. These urban centres housed populations larger than most Germanic tribal confederations, yet maintained order through administrative systems that functioned with minimal visible coercion. Rome itself overwhelmed visitors with its sheer magnitude and architectural grandeur. The city's population approached 1 million inhabitants during Augustus's reign, making it roughly 50 times larger than the most substantial Germanic settlements. The Forum Romanum, with its marble temples and bronze statues commemorating military victories, provided a constant reminder of imperial power and cultural sophistication. The Campus Martius hosted military exercises and public ceremonies that displayed Roman organisational capabilities through precisely choreographed demonstrations involving thousands of participants. The Circus Maximus accommodated audiences numbering in the hundreds of thousands, creating spectacles of mass entertainment that had no Germanic equivalent. Germanic hostages received accommodation in establishments appropriate to their noble status, typically within households of prominent Roman families who had been granted responsibility for their education and cultural assimilation. These arrangements placed young foreigners in direct contact with Roman domestic life, exposing them to social customs, religious practices, and intellectual traditions that differed fundamentally from their native cultures. Roman houses featured amenities unknown in Germanic territories, hypocourse heating systems that maintained comfortable temperatures throughout winter months, private bath suites with hot and cold running water, libraries containing hundreds of scrolls covering subjects from military engineering to philosophical speculation. The educational curriculum designed for Germanic hostages emphasized practical skills that would enhance their value as future Roman allies, while simultaneously demonstrating the superiority of Roman civilization. Latin instruction began immediately, since effective communication required fluency in the imperial administrative language. Unlike the oral tradition that preserved Germanic cultural knowledge, Roman education relied heavily on written materials that documented everything from legal precedents to military tactical manuals. Learning to read and write Latin provided access to accumulated Roman knowledge while creating psychological distance from purely oral Germanic traditions. Military training formed the cornerstone of the hostage education program, since these young men were expected to return to their tribes as effective military leaders capable of coordinating operations with Roman forces. Roman military doctrine emphasized discipline, standardization, and coordinated group tactics that contrasted sharply with the individualistic warrior traditions prevalent in Germanic culture. Training exercises focused on formation fighting, where success depended on maintaining unit cohesion rather than demonstrating personal prowess. Weapons instruction covered gladius techniques optimized for close-quarters combat within tight formations, javelin throwing that prioritized accuracy and timing over individual strength, and siege warfare methods that required coordinated engineering efforts. The Roman auxiliary system provided the institutional framework through which Germanic hostages could demonstrate their military capabilities while advancing within imperial service structures. Auxiliary units, composed primarily of non-citizen troops drawn from throughout the empire, served as crucial components of Roman military organization. These formations provided specialized capabilities that complemented legionary strengths, cavalry units from horse-breeding cultures, archers from regions with strong archery traditions, and light infantry skilled in terrain-specific warfare techniques. Germanic nobles entered auxiliary service with ranks reflecting their social status, typically beginning as decurions commanding cavalry squadrons or centurions leading infantry cohorts. Arminius's service record, reconstructed from fragmentary inscriptional evidence and later historical accounts, indicates exceptional performance within this auxiliary framework. His advancement to equestrian rank, the Roman social order immediately below senatorial status, required not only military competence, but also demonstrated loyalty to imperial interests. Equestrian status provided access to higher military commands, administrative positions within provincial governments, and social recognition within Roman society. This advancement represented a remarkable achievement for someone from a culture that Romans typically regarded as barbarous, indicating both personal capability and successful cultural adaptation. The psychological impact of Roman assimilation created complex identity conflicts that would ultimately prove crucial to Arminius's later actions. Roman educational methods systematically undermined traditional Germanic worldviews by presenting alternative explanations for natural phenomena, different concepts of political organization, and competing value systems that challenged fundamental assumptions about honor, loyalty, and social obligation. Roman religion, with its anthropomorphic deities and elaborate ceremonial structures, contrasted sharply with Germanic spiritual practices centered on natural forces and ancestral veneration. Roman legal traditions, emphasizing written codes and professional judicial procedures, differed fundamentally from Germanic customs based on oral tradition and community consensus. Yet complete cultural assimilation remained elusive, despite systematic Roman efforts to achieve this goal. Germanic identity proved remarkably resilient, maintained through personal relationships with other Germanic hostages, private observance of traditional religious practices, and psychological attachment to family and tribal connections that transcended physical separation. Roman attempts to create loyalty through generous treatment and advancement opportunities competed with deeper cultural bonds that connected individuals to their ancestral communities. The tension between Roman opportunity and Germanic identity created internal conflicts that shaped personality development in ways that Roman educators failed to anticipate or control. Military service provided opportunities for Germanic auxiliaries to observe Roman strengths and weaknesses from privileged positions within imperial military structures. Extended campaigns revealed logistical limitations that constrained Roman operations in difficult terrain, demonstrated the dependence of Roman tactical systems on specific environmental conditions, and exposed command relationships that could be exploited by enemies who understood Roman military culture. Germanic officers learned to recognize the signs of declining morale among Roman troops, identified the supply requirements that made Roman armies vulnerable to disruption, and gained first-hand knowledge of the intelligence-gathering methods that Romans used to maintain strategic advantages. The auxiliary system also provided Germanic leaders with extensive knowledge of Roman military technology and engineering capabilities. Siege warfare techniques, unknown in Germanic military traditions, became familiar through participation in Roman campaigns against fortified positions. Roman engineering methods, from road construction to bridge building, revealed the logistical foundations that supported Roman military operations across vast distances. Weapons manufacturing processes, armour design principles, and equipment maintenance procedures provided insights into the material advantages that gave Roman forces their technological superiority over most opponents. Service alongside troops from throughout the empire exposed Germanic auxiliaries to the full diversity of Roman military organisation. Gallic cavalry units demonstrated riding techniques adapted to different combat roles, while Balearic slingers showcased projectile weapons that could achieve remarkable accuracy at considerable ranges. Syrian archers provided examples of composite bow construction and specialised archery tactics, while North African light infantry displayed mobility techniques suited to desert warfare. This exposure to diverse military traditions broadened Germanic understanding of warfare possibilities, while revealing the extent of Roman military resources drawn from across the Mediterranean world. The social integration that accompanied military service created personal relationships that complicated simple loyalty calculations. Germanic auxiliaries formed friendships with Roman officers who treated them as valued colleagues, rather than subordinate foreigners. These relationships provided insights into Roman perspectives on imperial expansion, revealed the personal motivations that drove Roman military careers, and demonstrated the genuine respect that competent Germanic leaders could earn within Roman military culture. Such personal connections created emotional bonds that competed with tribal loyalties, generating additional psychological complexity in individuals already struggling with conflicting cultural identities. Economic exposure to Roman commercial networks revealed the material foundations of imperial power, while creating personal stakes in continued Roman success. Germanic auxiliaries received regular pay in Roman currency, accumulated savings that could be invested in Roman commercial enterprises, and gained access to luxury goods unavailable in their native territories. This economic integration created material incentives for continued cooperation with Roman authorities, while simultaneously demonstrating the wealth-generating capabilities of Roman economic systems. The contrast between Roman prosperity and Germanic material conditions provided powerful arguments for accepting Roman cultural and political dominance. The recall to Germania came through official channels sometime during the winter of 8 AD, delivered via military dispatch riders who traversed the frozen Alpine passes with characteristic Roman efficiency. Arminius received his assignment as auxiliary commander attached to Publius Quinctilius Varus's administrative apparatus, a position that carried significant prestige within the Roman military hierarchy, while simultaneously providing the perfect cover for what would become one of history's most consequential acts of strategic deception. The appointment reflected Roman confidence in their assimilation program's success. Here was a Germanic noble who had demonstrated unwavering loyalty through years of military service, achieved equestrian rank through proven competence, and possessed the cultural knowledge necessary to facilitate Roman expansion into territories that remained stubbornly resistant to imperial control. The journey northward from Rome reversed the cultural transition Arminius had experienced as a young hostage. but now he travelled as a Roman officer with authority to command troops and implement imperial policy. His military kit reflected this elevated status, a bronze-muscled cuirass decorated with relief scenes depicting Roman victories over Germanic tribes, a cavalry helmet with distinctive cheek guards and horsehair plume indicating officer rank, and weapons forged in Roman armories to specifications refined through centuries of military experience. His retinue included a personal servant, a scribe for maintaining official correspondence, and a small escort of veteran auxiliaries whose presence demonstrated the trust Roman authorities placed in their returning Germanic ally. The Rhine frontier had transformed dramatically during Arminius's absence in Roman service. What had once been a fluid boundary marked by scattered military outposts had evolved into a comprehensive defensive and administrative system, extending Roman control deep into territories that previous generations had considered permanently beyond imperial reach. Mogontiacum had expanded into a massive military complex housing 2 full legions plus auxiliary units, while new fortifications at Haltern, Oberaden and Anrepten created a network of supply bases supporting Roman operations as far east as the Weser River. Roman engineers had constructed roads penetrating the Germanic interior, following routes that bypassed traditional tribal strongholds, while connecting Roman installations with supply lines extending back to Gallic bases. The administrative apparatus governing these expanded territories reflected Roman confidence in their ability to transform Germanic society according to imperial models. Roman law had been extended to cover disputes involving Roman citizens operating within Germanic territories, while traditional Germanic legal practices remained valid for purely internal tribal matters. Tax collection systems, previously unknown in Germanic society, had been implemented to fund the military garrisons required for territorial security. Roman merchants had established permanent trading posts in major Germanic settlements, creating economic relationships that tied tribal prosperity to continued cooperation with imperial authorities. Verus himself embodied the Roman approach to provincial administration that had proven successful throughout the Mediterranean world. His previous experience governing Syria had demonstrated his capability for managing complex multi-ethnic territories where Roman authority coexisted with traditional local power structures. His appointment to the Germanic command reflected Augustus's belief that the same administrative methods that had pacified the eastern provinces could be successfully applied to the tribal societies beyond the Rhine. Verus brought with him a staff of experienced administrators, legal experts familiar with provincial law, and financial specialists capable of implementing the taxation systems that funded imperial expansion. The reunion with his father Segima and other Cheruscan leaders provided Arminius with his first opportunity to assess how Roman expansion had affected traditional tribal political dynamics. The Cherusci had maintained their confederation leadership role, but this authority now operated within constraints imposed by Roman oversight. Tribal assemblies continued to meet according to ancient customs, but their decisions required approval from Roman administrators before implementation. Traditional tribute relationships between the Cherusci and subordinate tribes had been partially replaced by Roman taxation systems that redirected wealth toward imperial rather than tribal purposes. Germanic warriors still served their traditional chiefs, but the most capable fighters were increasingly recruited into Roman auxiliary units, where their primary loyalty shifted toward imperial rather than tribal interests. Segima's position illustrated the complex accommodations that Germanic leaders had been forced to accept in exchange for maintaining nominal authority over their traditional territories. He retained ceremonial leadership of the Cheruscan Confederation and continued to preside over religious observances that reinforced tribal identity, but his practical authority had been circumscribed by Roman administrative requirements. Military decisions that had previously fallen within tribal leadership prerogatives now required coordination with Roman commanders who possessed superior resources and legal authority. economic policies affecting trade relationships, resource extraction, and agricultural production operated according to Roman priorities rather than traditional tribal practices. The psychological impact of these changes on Germanic society became apparent as Arminius renewed relationships with childhood companions and tribal leaders who had remained in Germanic territories throughout the period of Roman expansion. Many had adapted to Roman requirements with apparent success, learning Latin sufficiently to communicate with Roman administrators, adopting Roman commercial practices that increased their personal wealth, and accepting positions within the Roman administrative hierarchy that provided access to imperial resources. Others maintained more ambivalent attitudes toward Roman authority, complying with imperial requirements while privately preserving traditional Germanic values and customs. Arminius's unique position as both Roman auxiliary commander and Cheruscan noble provided him with unprecedented access to information about Roman military capabilities and strategic planning. His official duties required regular consultation with Varus and his staff regarding tribal political developments, potential security threats, and administrative challenges that might require military intervention. These discussions revealed Roman assumptions about Germanic political behaviour, identified the intelligence sources that Romans relied upon for strategic decision-making, and exposed the logistical limitations that constrained Roman military operations in difficult terrain. The Roman military presence in Germania operated according to doctrinal principles developed through centuries of frontier warfare, but these methods had been refined primarily through experience in Mediterranean environments that differed significantly from Germanic conditions. Roman tactical systems emphasized disciplined formation fighting that achieved maximum effectiveness on open ground, where superior training and equipment could prove decisive. The dense forests and marshy terrain characteristic of Germanic territories created environmental conditions that negated many Roman advantages, while favouring the mobility and terrain knowledge that Germanic warriors possessed. Roman supply systems, despite their remarkable efficiency, remained vulnerable to disruption in territories where hostile populations could threaten extended communication lines. The logistics required to maintain 3 legions, plus auxiliary units in Germanic territories demanded constant movement of supplies from Rhine bases through potentially hostile territory. Roman engineers had constructed roads and fortified supply depots to minimise these vulnerabilities, but the system remained dependent on predictable access to predetermined routes that could be blocked or destroyed by enemies familiar with local geography. Intelligence gathering represented another area where Roman capabilities, despite their sophistication, contained exploitable weaknesses. Roman administrators relied heavily on information provided by Germanic allies whose loyalty could not be independently verified. The cultural barriers that separated Romans from Germanic society limited their ability to assess the reliability of intelligence sources or to detect deception by informants who might be pursuing personal or tribal agendas. Roman confidence in their Germanic allies created opportunities for systematic misinformation that could compromise strategic decision-making at crucial moments. The recruitment of tribal allies for anti-Roman conspiracy required extraordinary discretion, given the comprehensive surveillance systems that Romans had established throughout their Germanic territories. Arminius approached potential conspirators through traditional Germanic social networks that operated according to kinship relationships and personal loyalty bonds that Romans found difficult to monitor or penetrate. Hunting expeditions provided opportunities for private discussions away from Roman observation, while religious festivals created context for gathering tribal leaders without arousing administrative suspicion. The initial recruitment focused on individuals whose positions within tribal hierarchies provided access to military resources, while ensuring their commitment to Germanic independence remained stronger than their accommodation to Roman authority. Tribal war leaders who had been forced to accept subordinate roles within Roman administrative systems represented obvious candidates, since their traditional authority had been most directly undermined by imperial expansion Younger warriors who'd been excluded from Roman auxiliary service due to capacity limitations or reliability concerns provided another recruitment pool, since they possessed military training while lacking the economic incentives that tied auxiliary veterans to continued Roman cooperation. Religious leaders played crucial roles in the developing conspiracy due to their influence over tribal identity and their access to communication networks that extended throughout Germanic territories. Germanic priests maintained traditional practices that reinforce cultural distinctiveness while providing psychological resistance to Roman cultural assimilation efforts. Their knowledge of sacred sites, seasonal festivals, and ritual obligations created opportunities for coordinated action that could be disguised as religious observance until the moment for open resistance arrived. The Chauci, whose coastal territories provided strategic advantages for military operations, while remaining relatively isolated from direct Roman administrative control, emerged as crucial allies in the developing anti-Roman coalition. Their naval capabilities offered possibilities for coordinated attacks against Roman supply lines, while their geographic position allowed them to provide sanctuary for Germanic forces operating against Roman installations. Chauci leaders had maintained greater independence from Roman influence compared to inland tribes, preserving traditional military organization and cultural practices that could support sustained resistance operations. Negotiations with potential tribal allies required careful assessment of their military capabilities, political reliability, and strategic value within the broader framework of anti-Roman operations. Some tribes possessed large warrior populations, but lacked the weapons or organization necessary for effective military action against Roman forces. Others had maintained strong military traditions, but occupied territories that provided limited strategic advantages for coordinated operations. The most valuable allies combined substantial military resources with geographic positions that could support sustained campaign operations while maintaining security from Roman retaliation. The timing of rebellion required coordination with seasonal patterns that affected both Roman military operations and Germanic agricultural cycles. Roman forces typically conducted major campaign operations during summer months when weather conditions favoured movement of large armies with extensive supply trains. Germanic agricultural obligations created competing demands on tribal military resources during planting and harvest seasons, when maximum manpower was required for survival-related activities. The optimal timing for anti-Roman operations would occur during periods when Roman forces were most vulnerable, while Germanic military resources could be concentrated for maximum effectiveness. Intelligence about Roman strategic planning became increasingly crucial as the conspiracy developed beyond initial recruitment phases. Arminius's position within Varus's administrative apparatus provided access to campaign schedules, troop movement plans, and logistical arrangements that could be exploited to achieve tactical surprise. Roman confidence in their Germanic allies created opportunities for gathering detailed information about military preparations, while simultaneously providing cover for conspiracy-related activities that might otherwise arouse administrative suspicion. The psychological preparation of Germanic warriors for coordinated military action against Roman forces required overcoming the intimidation factor created by previous Roman military successes and technological superiority. Germanic fighters had witnessed Roman tactical effectiveness during pacification campaigns that had systematically defeated tribal resistance throughout the region. Roman weapons and armour provided clear advantages in conventional combat situations, while Roman engineering capabilities enabled the construction of fortifications that could withstand traditional Germanic assault methods. Building confidence for sustained military operations against such formidable opponents required careful emphasis on environmental advantages and tactical opportunities that could neutralize Roman strengths while maximizing Germanic capabilities. The appointment of Publius Quinctilius Varus as governor of Germania in 6 AD represented Augustus's culminating effort to transform the tribal territories beyond the Rhine into a conventional Roman province. Varus arrived with credentials that embodied Roman confidence in their provincial administration model. His successful governorship of Syria from 4 BC had demonstrated his capability for managing complex territories where imperial authority operated alongside entrenched local power structures. Syria's diverse population of Greeks, Arameans, Arabs, and Jews had required administrative flexibility that balanced Roman legal requirements with traditional customs, while its strategic position demanded military competence sufficient to maintain security against Parthian threats and internal unrest. Augustus selected Varus specifically because his Syrian experience appeared directly applicable to Germanic conditions. Both territories contained multiple ethnic groups with distinct cultural traditions. Both required integration of tribal military forces into Roman auxiliary systems, and both demanded taxation policies that could fund imperial administration without provoking widespread resistance. The emperor's confidence in applying Mediterranean administrative models to Germanic society reflected broader Roman assumptions about the universality of their civilizing mission and the inevitable triumph of imperial organization over tribal chaos. Varus's administrative staff reflected standard Roman practice for newly established provinces. His legal advisors possessed expertise in provincial law developed through generations of imperial expansion, while his financial specialists had overseen taxation systems throughout the empire's diverse territories. Military tribunes assigned to his command brought experience from frontier operations in Britain, Pannonia, and other recently pacified regions, where Roman forces had successfully transitioned from conquest to occupation. This administrative apparatus operated according to established procedures that had proven effective across the Mediterranean world, yet these methods had never been tested against the specific challenges presented by Germanic tribal society. The governor's initial policies demonstrated characteristic Roman pragmatism in balancing imperial requirements with local conditions. Traditional Germanic legal practices remained valid for disputes between tribal members, while Roman law governed cases involving Roman citizens or intertribal conflicts that threatened regional stability. This dual legal system preserved tribal autonomy in internal affairs while establishing Roman authority over matters affecting imperial interests. Germanic chiefs retained ceremonial leadership roles and continued to collect traditional tributes from subordinate groups, but their authority now operated within parameters defined by Roman administrative oversight. Roman taxation policies introduced entirely foreign concepts into Germanic economic relationships. The tributum system, successfully implemented throughout the empire, required annual payments calculated according to property assessments conducted by Roman census officials. These assessments evaluated agricultural land, livestock holdings, and portable wealth according to standardized procedures that took no account of traditional Germanic concepts of communal ownership or seasonal resource sharing. The tax burden, while modest by Mediterranean standards, represented a fundamental challenge to tribal economic systems that had never operated according to monetary exchange principles or centralized revenue collection. The cultural implications of Roman legal and administrative integration proved even more disruptive than economic changes. Roman courts required written documentation for legal proceedings, challenging oral tradition systems that had preserved Germanic law through memorized precedents passed down through generations of tribal elders. Latin became the required language for official communications, creating barriers for tribal leaders who had never needed literacy skills for effective governance. Roman religious practices, while not explicitly imposed on Germanic populations, received official encouragement that gradually undermined traditional spiritual observances central to tribal identity. Roman military installations established throughout Germanic territories served multiple functions beyond simple frontier defence. The fortress complex at Halton, accommodated a full legion plus auxiliary units while providing secure storage for the vast quantities of supplies required to maintain Roman forces in hostile territory. Archaeological evidence reveals sophisticated workshop areas where Roman craftsmen repaired weapons and equipment while simultaneously training Germanic apprentices in Roman manufacturing techniques. These installations functioned as centres of cultural transmission, where Germanic youth encountered Roman technology, organisation methods, and social customs that challenged traditional tribal values. The road network constructed under Varus's administration represented Roman engineering capabilities at their most impressive. The primary route from Mogontiacum to the Weser River required construction of over 200 kilometres of paved roadway through terrain that included dense forests, marshy lowlands, and numerous river crossings. Roman engineers employed standardised construction techniques that created roadbeds capable of supporting heavy military traffic while remaining passable during seasonal flooding that regularly disrupted Germanic transportation routes. Bridge construction across major rivers demonstrated Roman mastery of stone arch techniques that enabled permanent crossings where Germanic tribes had relied on seasonal fords or temporary wooden structures. Supply depot construction at strategic intervals along these routes created a logistical network that could sustain Roman military operations far from Rhine bases. The installation at Unreppen contained storage facilities capable of housing 6 months' provisions for an entire legion, while its defensive walls and internal buildings followed architectural patterns perfected through centuries of frontier warfare. Roman quartermasters stockpiled not only basic military supplies, but also luxury items intended to reward cooperative tribal leaders and demonstrate the material benefits of Roman alliance. These depot systems enabled Roman forces to operate independently of local resources while maintaining the supply standards that Roman troops expected, regardless of campaign conditions. The composition of Roman forces under Varus's command reflected standard imperial practice for newly established provinces. The 16th, 68th and 18th legions provided the core military strength, each containing approximately 5,000 heavy infantry, organised into 10 cohorts with supporting specialist units. These legions had been recruited primarily from Italian populations, with supplementary manpower drawn from established provinces where Roman citizenship provided access to legionary service. The 16th Legion, originally formed during Augustus's military reforms, had served previously in Pannonian campaigns, where its troops gained experience in forest warfare against tribal opponents, employing tactics similar to Germanic methods. Auxiliary units attached to Varus's command totaled roughly 15,000 troops, drawn from throughout the empire's frontier regions. Germanic auxiliary cohorts, recruited from tribes that had accepted Roman alliance, provided cavalry and light infantry capabilities essential for operations in terrain unsuited to traditional legionary tactics. Gallic cavalry squadrons contributed mounted archery skills developed through generations of warfare against Germanic raiders, while their knowledge of Celtic languages facilitated communication with Germanic tribes whose dialects shared common linguistic roots. Balearic slingers and Syrian archers provided projectile capabilities that complemented Germanic close combat specializations. The positioning of these forces throughout Germanic territories followed strategic principles designed to maximize Roman control while minimizing logistical requirements. Major legionary bases occupied elevated positions that provided defensive advantages while commanding river crossings and road junctions crucial for regional transportation. Auxiliary detachments garrisoned smaller installations that monitored tribal movements and provided rapid response capabilities for local disturbances. This deployment pattern created overlapping zones of Roman influence that could support mutual reinforcement while maintaining surveillance over potentially hostile populations. Roman intelligence operations in Germania relied heavily on information provided by tribal allies, whose loyalty had been secured through various incentive systems. Prominent Germanic leaders received regular payments for reporting tribal political developments, potential security threats, and opportunities for expanding Roman influence. These intelligence relationships created networks of informants throughout Germanic territories, but they also established dependencies that could be exploited by tribal leaders pursuing anti-Roman agendas. Roman administrators possessed limited independent verification methods for assessing the reliability of intelligence provided by Germanic sources whose motivations might conflict with imperial interests. Arminius's role within this intelligence system provided him with unprecedented access to Roman strategic planning, while simultaneously enabling systematic deception operations that would prove crucial to Germanic resistance efforts. His position as trusted advisor to Varus required regular briefings on tribal political conditions, assessments of potential military threats, and recommendations for administrative policies affecting Germanic populations. These consultations revealed Roman assumptions about tribal behavior patterns, identified the sources Romans relied upon for strategic intelligence, and exposed decision-making processes that could be influenced through carefully crafted misinformation. The governor's personal relationship with Arminius reflected Roman confidence in their cultural assimilation programs and their ability to create genuine loyalty among former enemies. Varus treated his Germanic advisor as a valued colleague whose insights into tribal psychology proved essential for effective administration. This relationship provided Arminius with access to confidential discussions about Roman military planning, including detailed information about troop movements, supply schedules, and tactical preparations that would prove invaluable for coordinating Germanic resistance operations. Roman trust in their Germanic allies created vulnerabilities that could be systematically exploited by individuals whose apparent loyalty masked deeper commitments to tribal independence. The taxation system implemented under Varus's administration created widespread resentment that extended beyond simple economic grievances to challenge fundamental Germanic concepts of social organization and political authority. Roman tax collectors, supported by military escorts when necessary, conducted property assessments that violated traditional concepts of sacred groves and ancestral burial grounds. The requirement for monetary payments forced Germanic communities to engage with Roman commercial networks on unfavourable terms, since tribal economies had limited access to coined money and depended primarily on barter exchanges or tribute relationships. These economic pressures created hardships that affected all levels of Germanic society, while demonstrating Roman power to reshape traditional life patterns according to imperial requirements. Legal impositions proved equally disruptive to established Germanic social structures. Roman courts required written contracts for commercial transactions, challenging oral agreement systems that had regulated tribal economic relationships for generations. Legal procedures conducted in Latin excluded most Germanic participants from meaningful involvement in cases affecting their interests, while Roman legal concepts of individual property ownership conflicted with tribal customs emphasizing communal resource management. The requirement for Roman citizenship to access certain legal protections created artificial distinctions within Germanic communities that undermined traditional social cohesion. Cultural suppression, while never explicitly mandated by Roman policy, occurred through systematic encouragement of Roman practices at the expense of traditional Germanic customs. Roman religious festivals received official recognition and public funding, while traditional Germanic seasonal observances found their sacred sites occupied by Roman installations or their timing disrupted by administrative requirements. Educational opportunities favoured Germanic youth who demonstrated aptitude for Roman cultural assimilation, creating incentives for abandoning traditional knowledge systems in favour of Latin literacy and Roman technical skills. These cultural pressures operated gradually but persistently to erode the foundations of Germanic identity that had sustained tribal resistance to foreign domination. The Roman military presence, despite its impressive scale and technological sophistication, contained strategic vulnerabilities that careful observation could identify and potentially exploit. Roman tactical doctrine emphasized formation fighting that achieved maximum effectiveness on open ground, where disciplined coordination could overcome individual warrior prowess. The dense forests characteristic of Germanic territories created environmental conditions that negated Roman organizational advantages while favoring the mobility and terrain knowledge that Germanic fighters possessed. Roman supply lines, despite elaborate protective measures, remained vulnerable to disruption by enemies who understood local geography and could coordinate attacks against predetermined targets. Intelligence gathering represented another area where Roman capabilities, though extensive, possessed exploitable limitations. Roman administrators depended heavily on Germanic informants whose reliability could not be independently verified through alternative sources. Cultural barriers prevented Romans from developing direct relationships with tribal populations that might reveal the true extent of anti-Roman sentiment or the existence of resistance networks operating beyond official surveillance. Roman confidence in their Germanic allies created opportunities for systematic deception that could compromise strategic decision-making at crucial moments when accurate intelligence would prove essential for military success. The recruitment of tribal allies required Arminius to navigate the labyrinthine web of Germanic political relationships with extraordinary precision, since a single misstep could expose the entire conspiracy to Roman surveillance networks that had been systematically expanded throughout the occupied territories. Traditional Germanic diplomacy operated through personal relationships established over generations of intermarriage, shared military campaigns, and ritual obligations that bound tribes through sacred oaths sworn before their ancestral deities. These ancient networks provided the foundation for anti-Roman coordination, but they also created vulnerabilities since Roman administrators had spent years identifying key tribal leaders and monitoring their political activities through informant networks that penetrated deep into Germanic society. The Bructeri emerged as crucial early allies due to their strategic position along the Lippe River Valley and their long-standing resentment of Roman territorial encroachments that had displaced several of their traditional settlements. Their chief, whose name Roman sources record as Boioculus, commanded approximately 3,000 warriors organized into traditional clan-based units that retained their indigenous weapons, training, and tactical knowledge. Unlike tribes closer to Roman administrative centres, the Bructeri had maintained their traditional military structure largely intact, with experienced war leaders who understood forest warfare techniques that could neutralize Roman tactical advantages. Their territory included several sacred groves that served as meeting places for intertribal negotiations, providing secure locations where conspiracy planning could proceed without Roman observation. Boioculus brought to the alliance not only his own tribal military resources, but also established relationships with smaller tribes throughout the Westphalian region, who had been forced to accept tributary status under Roman administration. These subordinate groups, the Comavi, Angrivari, and Tubantes, possessed limited individual military capabilities but collectively could field several thousand additional warriors whose local knowledge proved invaluable for coordinating operations across the diverse terrain of the planned rebellion zone. Their chiefs had maintained traditional warrior training despite Roman efforts to redirect tribal military resources toward auxiliary service, preserving combat skills specifically adapted to the dense forests and marshy lowlands that characterized their territories. The recruitment of Marsi tribal leaders required more delicate negotiations due to their geographic proximity to major Roman installations and their extensive involvement in Roman commercial networks that had created economic dependencies complicating simple anti-Roman sentiment. The Marsi controlled territory along the upper Ruhr River that contained iron ore deposits exploited by Roman mining operations, making their cooperation essential for disrupting Roman supply chains, while simultaneously making their defection economically costly. Their chief, Malavendus, had initially benefited from Roman commercial relationships that provided access to Mediterranean luxury goods and advanced metalworking techniques, but growing taxation demands and administrative interference in traditional tribal governance had gradually eroded his enthusiasm for continued cooperation. Malavendus commanded roughly 2,500 warriors whose equipment included Roman-manufactured weapons acquired through auxiliary service or commercial exchange, creating tactical capabilities that bridged traditional Germanic fighting methods with Roman military technology. His forces included a substantial cavalry component trained in both Germanic hit and run tactics and Roman formation fighting, providing mobility advantages crucial for coordinating attacks across the extensive territory encompassed by the rebellion plan. The Marsi also possessed detailed knowledge of Roman supply routes and depot locations gained through their involvement in Roman commercial operations, intelligence that would prove essential for targeting the logistical vulnerabilities that sustained Roman military presence in Germanic territories. The Chatti represented the most militarily formidable potential allies, with a warrior tradition that had earned Roman respect through generations of frontier warfare and a political organisation sophisticated enough to coordinate large-scale military operations across extended campaign periods. Their territory in the mountainous regions of modern Hesse provided natural defensive advantages while supporting a population capable of fielding over 5,000 experienced fighters organised into disciplined units that employed tactical coordination unusual among Germanic tribes. Chatti military culture emphasised systematic training and standardised equipment that created combat effectiveness rivaling Roman auxiliary units, while maintaining the mobility and terrain knowledge that gave Germanic forces their primary advantages over Roman legionary tactics. The Chatti chief, Adgandestrius, had maintained careful neutrality toward Roman expansion while secretly preserving military preparations that could support either defensive operations against Roman attack or offensive participation in anti-Roman coalitions. His diplomatic approach reflected sophisticated understanding of Roman strategic planning and the recognition that premature resistance would invite devastating retaliation before adequate preparation could ensure success. Adganestrius possessed extensive intelligence about Roman military capabilities gained through careful observation of Roman operations against neighbouring tribes, knowledge that proved crucial for developing tactical plans capable of achieving decisive results against Roman forces operating under predictable doctrinal constraints. The negotiation process with potential tribal allies required careful attention to traditional Germanic diplomatic protocols that emphasise personal honour, kinship obligations, and religious sanctions that bound participants to their commitments. Arminius approached each tribal leader through established relationship networks that provided cultural legitimacy for his proposals while creating opportunities for private discussions away from Roman surveillance. Hunting expeditions served as particularly effective covers for these negotiations, since they provided plausible explanations for tribal leaders to meet in remote locations while engaging in activities that reinforced traditional Germanic cultural values and created psychological distance from Roman administrative oversight. Sacred festivals provided additional opportunities for coordinated planning disguised as religious observance, since Germanic spiritual practices required gatherings that brought together tribal leaders from throughout the region for ceremonial activities that Romans typically ignored as primitive superstition. The spring equinox celebrations honouring Ostara created context for discussing agricultural coordination that could mask military planning, while autumn harvest festivals provided opportunities for distributing weapons and supplies under cover of traditional gift exchanges between allied tribes. These religious gatherings reinforced the spiritual dimensions of resistance to Roman cultural domination, while creating practical frameworks for coordinating complex military operations across multiple tribal territories. The recruitment of Ingiomarus, Arminius' uncle and a prominent Cheruscan war leader, presented particular challenges due to his initial skepticism about the feasibility of sustained military operations against Roman forces whose technological and organizational advantages had proven decisive in previous Germanic resistance efforts. Inguiomerus possessed extensive military experience gained through service in Roman auxiliary units, providing him with detailed knowledge of Roman tactical capabilities and logistical requirements that made him acutely aware of the difficulties involved in achieving decisive victories against professional Roman armies. His concerns reflected broader Germanic awareness of Roman military superiority and the recognition that unsuccessful resistance would invite catastrophic retaliation against tribal populations. Inguiomerus' eventual conversion to the conspiracy reflected careful presentation of tactical plans that addressed his specific concerns about Roman military advantages while demonstrating how environmental conditions and coordinated tribal action could create opportunities for achieving decisive results. The selection of the Teutoburg forest as the primary engagement location provided terrain advantages that would neutralize Roman formation fighting capabilities while maximizing Germanic mobility and local knowledge. The timing of operations during autumn weather conditions would create additional challenges for Roman supply systems while providing Germanic forces with seasonal advantages derived from their adaptation to local environmental conditions. The strategic planning process required unprecedented coordination between tribal military leaders whose traditional independence had been preserved through generations of resistance to external authority. Germanic military culture emphasized individual warrior prowess and clan-based unit organization that created tactical flexibility but complicated efforts to achieve the disciplined coordination necessary for sustained operations against Roman forces. The development of unified command structures required careful negotiation of traditional precedence claims, while creating tactical frameworks that could integrate diverse tribal military capabilities into coherent operational plans. The selection of the Teutoburg forest as the primary ambush location reflected detailed analysis of Roman operational patterns and the geographic requirements necessary for achieving tactical surprise against forces whose intelligence capabilities had proven effective at detecting Germanic military preparations. The forest region provided several crucial advantages: dense woodland that would prevent Roman formation fighting, while enabling Germanic forces to employ traditional individual combat techniques; marshy ground conditions that would impede Roman heavy infantry movement while favouring Germanic light infantry mobility; and limited access routes that would channel Roman forces into predetermined killing zones where coordinated tribal attacks could achieve maximum effectiveness. The terrain analysis revealed specific geographic features that could be exploited to create tactical advantages for Germanic forces while minimizing Roman capabilities to employ their superior organization and equipment. Narrow passages between wooded hills would prevent Roman units from deploying in their preferred battle formations, while creating opportunities for Germanic forces to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Stream crossings at strategic locations could be prepared as ambush sites, where Roman forces would be most vulnerable while Germanic attackers possessed maximum terrain advantages. The extensive woodland provided numerous escape routes that would enable Germanic forces to withdraw and regroup if initial attacks failed to achieve decisive results. Counterintelligence operations required systematic deception of Roman surveillance networks, while maintaining the appearance of normal tribal political activity that would not arouse administrative suspicion. Arminius' position within Varus's staff provided crucial advantages for monitoring Roman intelligence gathering, while simultaneously feeding carefully crafted misinformation that would support the conspiracy's security requirements. Regular reports to Roman administrators emphasized tribal political stability and continued cooperation with imperial policies, while actual coordination activities proceeded through traditional Germanic communication networks that operated beyond Roman observation capabilities. The maintenance of operational security required elaborate precautions to prevent information about conspiracy planning from reaching Roman informants whose identities remained unknown to tribal leaders, but whose existence was assumed based on Roman administrative effectiveness at detecting previous resistance efforts. Crucial planning discussions occurred only during traditional religious ceremonies, where participants could claim spiritual obligations that excluded non-Germanic observers, while military preparations were disguised as seasonal hunting activities or agricultural work that required coordination between tribal groups. Weapons caching proceeded through traditional ritual burial practices that provided religious justification for activities that might otherwise appear suspicious to Roman surveillance networks. The timing coordination for simultaneous tribal mobilization required careful attention to seasonal patterns that affected both Roman military operations and Germanic agricultural obligations. Roman campaign schedules typically concentrated major operations during summer months, when weather conditions favoured movement of large armies with extensive supply trains, while Germanic agricultural cycles created competing demands on tribal military resources during planting and harvest periods, when maximum manpower was required for community survival. The optimal timing for coordinated action would occur during late summer or early autumn, when Roman forces might be conducting routine operations, while Germanic communities had completed agricultural work that freed warriors for extended military service. The weapons procurement necessary for equipping tribal forces for sustained operations against Roman armies required careful coordination of traditional Germanic metalworking capabilities with captured or purchased Roman military equipment that could provide technological advantages in crucial combat situations. Germanic smiths possessed sophisticated ironworking skills that produced weapons comparable to Roman equipment in quality while incorporating design features specifically adapted to Germanic fighting techniques and environmental conditions. However, Roman armour and siege equipment possessed technological advantages that could prove decisive in extended combat, making acquisition of Roman military supplies a crucial component of rebellion preparation. The development of tactical coordination between tribal units that had never operated together in large-scale military operations required extensive training exercises disguised as traditional seasonal activities that provided plausible explanations for gatherings of armed warriors from multiple tribes. These exercises focused on communication systems that could coordinate attacks across extended battlefields, withdrawal procedures that could preserve Germanic forces if initial operations failed to achieve decisive results, and integration of diverse tribal military specializations into unified tactical approaches that maximized collective effectiveness against Roman formation fighting techniques. The false intelligence that triggered Varus's fatal march originated from Arminius's carefully orchestrated deception network, which had spent months establishing credibility through accurate reports about minor tribal disturbances that Roman forces had successfully resolved. On the morning of September 8, 9 AD, Arminius presented Varus with urgent intelligence about a rebellion among the distant Angrivarii, a tribe whose territory lay approximately 150 kilometers northeast of the Roman summer camp at Minden. The report described coordinated attacks against Roman supply convoys and the destruction of a minor administrative outpost, events that demanded immediate military intervention to prevent the spread of anti-Roman sentiment throughout the region. Varus accepted this intelligence without independent verification, a decision that reflected both his trust in Arminius and the operational pressures created by Augustus's expectations for maintaining Roman authority throughout the newly established province. The emperor's recent correspondence had emphasized the importance of decisive action against any signs of Germanic resistance, making delay politically dangerous for a governor whose career advancement depended on demonstrating effective provincial administration. The timing appeared strategically sound, since early autumn weather still permitted large-scale military operations, while the completion of harvest activities had freed Germanic populations from agricultural obligations that might otherwise complicate punitive campaigns. The Roman column that departed the Minden camp on September 9th represented one of the most formidable military forces ever assembled for operations in Germanic territory. The 60th, 68th, and 13th legions provided the core strength, with each legion maintaining approximately 5,200 men organised into 10 cohorts of heavy infantry, supported by specialist units, including engineers, artillery crews, and medical personnel. The legionary troops carried standardised equipment refined through centuries of military experience. The Gladius Hispaniensis optimised for close-quarters formation fighting, the Scutum providing comprehensive protection while maintaining tactical mobility, and the Pilum designed to disrupt enemy formations through its specialised penetration capabilities and structural design that prevented reuse by opponents. Auxiliary units attached to the expedition totaled roughly 10,000 troops representing the Empire's diverse military traditions and specialised capabilities. Germanic cavalry squadrons, recruited from allied tribes and commanded by Roman officers, provided reconnaissance capabilities and tactical mobility essential for operations in terrain unsuited to traditional legionary methods. Gallic infantry cohorts contributed experience in forest warfare gained through generations of conflict with Germanic raiders, while their linguistic skills facilitated communication with local populations whose cooperation might prove necessary for successful campaign operations. Balearic slingers and Syrian archers provided projectile capabilities that complemented the close combat specializations of legionary and Germanic units. The civilian contingent accompanying the military force reflected standard Roman practice for campaign operations that might extend over several weeks in territories lacking established supply networks. Camp followers included approximately 5,000 individuals whose services were considered essential for maintaining military effectiveness during extended operations. Merchants authorized to trade with Roman troops, craftsmen capable of repairing weapons and equipment, medical personnel supplementing military medical services, and family members of officers and senior non-commissioned personnel whose presence reflected the semi-permanent nature of Roman military assignments in frontier provinces. The baggage train required to support this combined force stretched over several kilometres when organised for march formation, creating logistical challenges that would prove crucial to Germanic tactical planning. Supply wagons carried provisions for 30 days of independent operations, including grain rations for human consumption, fodder for cavalry horses and draft animals, replacement weapons and armour for combat losses, and engineering supplies necessary for constructing fortified camps according to standard Roman defensive procedures. Artillery pieces, including ballistas and scorpions, required specialised transport arrangements that reduced overall march mobility, while providing siege capabilities that might prove necessary for reducing Germanic fortifications. The march route selected by Roman staff officers followed established roads constructed during previous campaign seasons, pathways that provided the most direct access to Angrivari territory while maintaining connection to Roman supply bases along the Rhine frontier. These roads represented impressive engineering achievements that demonstrated Roman technological capabilities. Stone-paved surfaces capable of supporting heavy military traffic, drainage systems that maintained passability during seasonal flooding, and bridge construction across major rivers that eliminated dependence on seasonal fords or temporary crossings. However, the predictability of these routes also provided Germanic forces with detailed knowledge of Roman movement patterns and opportunities for selecting optimal ambush locations. The first day's march proceeded according to standard Roman operational procedures, with advance scouts maintaining surveillance over the route ahead, while flank guards provided security against surprise attacks from the dense woodlands that bordered the roadway. Roman engineers had cleared vegetation for approximately 50 metres on each side of the main route, creating fields of fire for Roman projectile weapons, while eliminating cover that might conceal Germanic ambush forces. Guard posts established at regular intervals provided communication links between different sections of the extended column, while creating rally points that could coordinate defensive responses if the march came under attack. Germanic observation of the Roman advance proceeded through surveillance networks that had been carefully positioned throughout the region during the preceding weeks of conspiracy preparation. Tribal scouts, operating in small groups that could move through the forest without detection, maintained continuous monitoring of Roman progress while providing detailed intelligence about column organization, security procedures, and tactical vulnerabilities that could be exploited during planned ambush operations. These observers identified the specific locations of baggage trains, artillery pieces, and command groups whose destruction or capture would create maximum disruption of Roman military capabilities. The weather conditions during the initial march period favoured Roman operations, with clear skies and moderate temperatures that maintained optimal conditions for moving large military formations across difficult terrain. However, Germanic meteorological knowledge, accumulated through generations of seasonal observation, indicated that atmospheric conditions were developing that would likely produce the heavy rainfall and strong winds that typically characterize late summer weather patterns in the region. These environmental factors had been incorporated into Germanic tactical planning, since adverse weather would create additional challenges for Roman formation fighting while providing Germanic forces with familiar conditions that matched their environmental adaptation and tactical training. On the evening of September 9th, the Roman column established its first fortified camp according to standard defensive procedures that had proven effective throughout the empire's frontier regions. Roman engineers supervised the construction of earthwork fortifications that created a defensive perimeter encompassing the entire force, with palisade walls, defensive ditches, and gate structures that provided security against night attacks while establishing the organised layout necessary for efficient camp administration. Internal organisation followed standardised patterns that positioned different units according to tactical requirements while providing clear access routes for emergency deployment if defensive operations became necessary. The Germanic response to Roman camp construction involved positioning tribal forces in concealed locations that provided surveillance of Roman defensive preparations while maintaining security from Roman counter-reconnaissance operations. Germanic knowledge of local terrain enabled the selection of observation positions that remained invisible to Roman sentries while providing detailed intelligence about Roman security procedures, guard rotation schedules, and defensive vulnerabilities that might be exploited if circumstances permitted attacks against the fortified position. However, Germanic tactical planning emphasized avoiding direct assaults against prepared Roman defenses, focusing instead on creating opportunities for ambush operations during vulnerable march phases. September 10th brought the deteriorating weather conditions that Germanic planning had anticipated, with heavy rainfall beginning during the pre-dawn hours and continuing throughout the day with intensity that transformed the established roadways into muddy tracks that significantly impeded Roman march progress. The precipitation created immediate challenges for maintaining formation integrity, as wheeled vehicles became mired in increasingly difficult ground conditions, while the weight of saturated equipment reduced the mobility of individual soldiers whose standardized gear had not been designed for extended operations in persistent, wet conditions. The Roman response to these environmental challenges demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of imperial military organization. Roman engineering capabilities enabled rapid construction of corduroy roads across particularly difficult sections, using timber resources available from the surrounding forests to create temporary surfaces that could support heavy traffic. However, these construction activities required significant time and manpower that reduced overall march progress while creating additional security vulnerabilities as engineering parties worked in exposed positions that provided opportunities for Germanic harassment attacks. Germanic forces began their harassment operations during the afternoon of September 10th, employing hit-and-run tactics that exploited their superior mobility and terrain knowledge to inflict casualties while avoiding decisive engagement with Roman main forces. Small groups of Germanic warriors, typically numbering between 20 and 50 individuals, approached the Roman column through concealed forest routes that enabled them to achieve tactical surprise against isolated Roman units. These attacks focused on targeting baggage trains, supply wagons, and rearguard elements that possessed limited defensive capabilities, while their destruction would create maximum disruption of Roman operational effectiveness. The initial Germanic attacks employed traditional weapons and tactics that maximized their environmental advantages while avoiding direct confrontation with Roman heavy infantry formations. Germanic spears, designed for throwing accuracy rather than formation fighting, proved effective against Roman troops, whose armour provided limited protection against projectiles delivered from concealed positions at close range. Germanic shields, constructed from lightweight materials that prioritized mobility over comprehensive protection, enabled rapid movement through dense vegetation, while providing adequate defense against Roman counterattacks launched from predictable positions along the established roadway. Roman tactical responses to these harassment attacks revealed the limitations of imperial military doctrine when applied to environmental conditions that negated traditional organizational advantages. Roman formation fighting required open ground where disciplined coordination could achieve maximum effectiveness, but the dense forest terrain prevented deployment of standard tactical arrangements, while providing Germanic attackers with numerous escape routes that made pursuit operations ineffective. Roman heavy armour and standardized equipment, optimized for Mediterranean warfare conditions, created mobility disadvantages that became increasingly significant as environmental conditions deteriorated. The evening of September 10th marked the beginning of systematic Germanic psychological warfare operations designed to undermine Roman morale while creating panic that would compromise military discipline during crucial tactical situations. Germanic warriors, positioned in concealed locations surrounding the Roman camp, began producing coordinated vocal demonstrations that combined traditional war cries with deliberate mimicry of Roman distress signals. These acoustic attacks continued throughout the night hours, preventing Roman troops from obtaining adequate rest while creating uncertainty about the actual location and strength of Germanic forces operating in the surrounding terrain. September 11th brought intensified Germanic military pressure as tribal forces implemented the coordinated tactical plans that had been developed during months of conspiracy preparation. The Roman column, now significantly reduced in march efficiency due to equipment losses and environmental challenges, entered the section of the route that provided optimal conditions for the decisive ambush operations that would determine the campaign's ultimate outcome. The terrain in this area featured narrow passages between wooded hills that channeled Roman movement into predetermined killing zones, while providing Germanic forces with elevated positions that maximized their tactical advantages. The Germanic ambush commenced at approximately mid-morning when the Roman advance guard entered the narrowest section of the available route, where dense woodland on both sides restricted movement to a corridor roughly 30 meters wide. Germanic forces, positioned in carefully prepared positions that provided concealment while enabling coordinated attacks, launched simultaneous assaults against multiple sections of the extended Roman column. These attacks employed massed archery that targeted Roman officers and standard-bearers whose elimination would create command confusion, while coordinated spear attacks focused on disrupting Roman formation integrity through concentrated pressure against specific tactical units. The Roman response to the Germanic ambush demonstrated the professional competence that had made imperial armies effective throughout the Mediterranean world, but also revealed the limitations of standard tactical procedures when applied to environmental conditions that prevented optimal deployment of Roman organizational capabilities. Roman centurions attempted to establish defensive formations according to established procedures, but the narrow confines of the available terrain prevented proper unit spacing, while the continuing Germanic attacks from elevated positions created casualties that compromised formation integrity before effective defensive arrangements could be completed. Germanic tactical coordination during the ambush operations reflected sophisticated military planning that maximized tribal military capabilities while systematically exploiting Roman vulnerabilities that had been identified through careful observation of imperial operational procedures. Different tribal units assumed specialized roles within the overall tactical framework. Cherusci forces focused on eliminating Roman command personnel whose death would create leadership confusion. Bructeri warriors targeted Roman artillery pieces whose destruction would eliminate Roman siege capabilities. Chatti forces concentrated on capturing or destroying Roman supply trains whose loss would create logistical crises that would compromise continued Roman operations, even if immediate tactical objectives were not achieved. The systematic destruction of Roman military effectiveness proceeded through coordinated attacks that prevented Roman forces from implementing the tactical responses that might have enabled successful defensive operations or organised withdrawal to more favourable terrain. Germanic knowledge of Roman tactical procedures enabled prediction of likely Roman responses to ambush conditions, allowing tribal forces to prepare countermeasures that would neutralise Roman attempts to establish defensive positions or coordinate counterattacks against Germanic positions. The environmental conditions that had been carefully selected for the ambush location prevented Roman forces from employing their superior organisational capabilities while maximising the terrain knowledge and individual combat skills that provided Germanic forces with their primary military advantages. The collapse of Roman military organisation accelerated throughout the afternoon of September 11th as Germanic pressure intensified and Roman casualties mounted to levels that compromised unit effectiveness across the entire force. Roman attempts to maintain formation discipline became increasingly difficult as environmental conditions deteriorated and Germanic attacks prevented the establishment of secure positions where reorganisation might be attempted. The psychological impact of systematic Germanic success began affecting Roman morale as professional soldiers who had never experienced decisive defeat confronted tactical situations that their training had not prepared them to handle effectively. The news of the Teutoburg disaster reached Rome through a series of increasingly frantic dispatches that began arriving in late September 9th AD, each messenger bearing fragments of information that gradually assembled into a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions for Augustus's imperial ambitions. The initial reports, delivered by Germanic auxiliaries who had escaped the slaughter, spoke of coordinated tribal attacks and heavy Roman casualties, but the full scope of the defeat only became apparent when surviving Roman officers reached Rhine fortifications and provided detailed accounts of the systematic destruction of 3 entire legions, plus their auxiliary support units. Augustus received the definitive confirmation of Varus's death and the annihilation of his army while conducting routine administrative business in his private study, surrounded by the marble busts of his predecessors and the carefully organised scrolls that documented 30 years of imperial expansion. Contemporary accounts describe the emperor's initial reaction as stunned silence, followed by a physical collapse that required immediate medical attention from his personal physicians. The psychological impact of learning that approximately 25,000 Roman soldiers had been killed or captured in Germanic territory created trauma that would affect Augustus's decision-making for the remainder of his reign. The famous cry, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions as soon," emerged from Augustus's subsequent emotional breakdown, during which witnesses reported that the emperor repeatedly struck his head against the marble walls of his study while demanding the return of military units that no longer existed. This outburst reflected not merely personal grief over the loss of a trusted subordinate, but recognition that the Teutoburg defeat represented the most significant military catastrophe of his reign and a fundamental challenge to the imperial expansion policy that had defined Roman strategic objectives for the previous generation. The immediate administrative response to the Germanic victory revealed the extent to which Roman imperial planning had become dependent on continuous military success to maintain political stability and economic prosperity. Augustus ordered the suspension of all offensive operations beyond established frontiers while redirecting military resources toward defensive preparations that could prevent Germanic raids against Gallic territories. The emperor's decision to recall veteran legions from Pannonian and Illyrian commands demonstrated recognition that the Germanic threat now required the empire's most experienced military units, regardless of the strategic complications created by weakening other frontier regions. Roman financial markets reacted to news of the Teutoburg disaster with panic selling that threatened the economic stability of commercial networks extending throughout the Mediterranean world. Germanic territorial control had been factored into investment calculations involving mining operations, agricultural development projects, and commercial enterprises that depended on continued Roman expansion for their profitability. The sudden loss of these territories, combined with the massive military expenditures required for defensive preparations, created fiscal pressures that forced Augustus to implement emergency taxation measures throughout the empire's established provinces. The strategic withdrawal from territories east of the Rhine began immediately after confirmation of Varus's defeat, as Roman commanders recognized that maintaining isolated garrisons in hostile territory would invite systematic destruction by Germanic forces whose tactical capabilities had been dramatically demonstrated through their annihilation of professional Roman armies. The evacuation of Haltern, Oberaden, Anreppen, and other advance bases required careful coordination to prevent Germanic forces from intercepting withdrawal columns that would be vulnerable to the same ambush tactics that had proven so effective against Varus's expedition. Roman engineers supervised the systematic destruction of military installations that could not be evacuated intact, employing fire and demolition techniques that prevented Germanic forces from acquiring Roman military technology or using abandoned fortifications as bases for raids against remaining Roman positions. The destruction of supply depots eliminated vast quantities of weapons, armour and equipment that had been accumulated over years of campaign preparation, representing material losses that would require extensive time and resources to replace through Mediterranean manufacturing networks. The psychological impact of Germanic military success extended far beyond the immediate territorial losses, creating morale problems throughout Roman frontier armies whose confidence in imperial military superiority had been fundamentally shaken by evidence that professional Roman forces could be systematically defeated by tribal opponents employing traditional weapons and tactics. Recruitment difficulties emerged in Italian territories where military service had previously been considered a pathway to social advancement and economic security, as potential soldiers recognized that Germanic warfare created casualty rates far exceeding those experienced in Mediterranean campaign operations. Tiberius received command of the emergency military response to the Germanic crisis in October 9th AD, bringing to the assignment military experience gained through successful campaigns in Pannonia, Illyria, and other frontier regions, where Roman forces had established effective tactical procedures for operations against tribal opponents. His appointment reflected Augustus's recognition that the Germanic situation required commanders whose competence had been proven through actual frontier warfare rather than administrative experience in pacified provinces. Tiberius's previous service as a military tribune and legionary commander provided him with detailed knowledge of Roman tactical capabilities and limitations when applied to challenging terrain and hostile populations. The military resources allocated to Tiberius's command represented the largest concentration of Roman forces ever assembled for Germanic operations, totaling approximately 8 legions plus auxiliary units drawn from throughout the empire's frontier regions. The 8 Augusta and Puy Rapax legions provided veteran heavy infantry whose experience in previous Germanic campaigns offered crucial tactical knowledge for operations in forest terrain where standard Roman procedures required modification to achieve effectiveness. Auxiliary cavalry units recruited from Gallic and Thracian territories contributed mobility capabilities essential for reconnaissance operations and rapid response to Germanic raids against Roman supply lines. Tiberius's initial campaign strategy emphasized cautious advance and systematic intelligence gathering, rather than the aggressive pursuit of decisive battle that had characterized Varus's approach to Germanic operations. Roman forces established fortified bases at carefully selected intervals that provided mutual support while creating secure positions for supply operations and tactical regrouping if Germanic attacks achieved temporary success. This methodical approach reflected recognition that Germanic tactical capabilities required Roman forces to maintain superior defensive positions while avoiding the kind of extended march operations that had created vulnerabilities exploited so effectively during the Teutoburg ambush. The 10 AD campaign season focused primarily on reconnaissance operations designed to assess Germanic military organisation and identify potential weaknesses that could be exploited during subsequent offensive operations. Roman cavalry patrols, supported by Germanic auxiliary units, whose tribal knowledge provided crucial intelligence about local terrain and political conditions, conducted systematic surveys of territories that had been abandoned during the post-Teutoburg withdrawal. These operations revealed that Germanic forces had not attempted to establish permanent control over former Roman installations, suggesting that tribal military organisation remained focused on defensive objectives rather than territorial expansion that would require sustained administrative capabilities. Germanic responses to Roman reconnaissance activities demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Roman tactical procedures and coordinated defensive planning that extended the military cooperation established during the Teutoburg conspiracy. Tribal forces employed systematic harassment tactics that inflicted casualties on Roman patrol units while avoiding decisive engagements that might provide Roman commanders with opportunities to employ their superior organisational advantages. Germanic ambush operations targeted Roman supply convoys and communication networks, creating logistical challenges that limited the scope of Roman operations while demonstrating continued tribal military effectiveness. The intelligence gathered during Tiberius's initial operations revealed significant changes in Germanic political organisation that had resulted from the psychological impact of military success against Roman forces. Arminius's leadership role had expanded beyond traditional Cheruscan boundaries to encompass coordination of military activities among multiple tribal groups, whose cooperation created defensive capabilities that individual tribes could not have achieved independently. This pan-Germanic military alliance represented an unprecedented development in tribal political organisation, creating strategic challenges that required Roman responses extending beyond traditional military solutions. Roman diplomatic efforts to exploit traditional tribal rivalries and recreate the political divisions that had facilitated earlier imperial expansion encountered systematic resistance from Germanic leaders whose shared military success had created psychological bonds transcending traditional ethnic boundaries. Attempts to negotiate separate agreements with individual tribal chiefs revealed that Germanic political decision-making had become increasingly centralized under Arminius's influence, eliminating the political fragmentation that Roman administrators had previously exploited to advance imperial objectives through divide-and-conquer strategies. The 11 AD campaign brought intensified Roman military pressure as Tiberius received reinforcement by 2 additional legions plus specialized auxiliary units equipped for siege operations against Germanic fortifications. Roman engineering capabilities enabled construction of fortified roads that provided secure communication lines between Rhine bases and advanced positions, while systematic forest clearing operations created fields of fire that reduced Germanic opportunities for employing their preferred ambush tactics. These engineering projects required massive labour investments that demonstrated Roman determination to achieve permanent territorial control despite the tactical challenges created by Germanic resistance. Germanic counter-operations during the 11 AD campaign demonstrated tactical innovation that incorporated lessons learned from observing Roman military procedures while maintaining the environmental advantages that had proven so effective during previous resistance efforts. Tribal forces employed coordinated attacks against Roman engineering projects, targeting construction equipment and specialist personnel whose loss created significant delays in Roman operational schedules. Germanic raids against Roman supply lines intensified in frequency and effectiveness, indicating improved coordination between tribal military units operating across extended territorial ranges. The systematic destruction of Roman supply convoys created logistical crises that limited the scope of offensive operations, while demonstrating Germanic understanding of Roman military vulnerabilities. Tribal forces targeted specific categories of supplies whose loss would create maximum disruption of Roman military effectiveness. Medical supplies needed for treating combat casualties, replacement weapons and armour required for maintaining unit readiness, and specialised equipment necessary for siege operations against Germanic fortifications. These selective targeting strategies indicated sophisticated intelligence about Roman military organisation and supply requirements. Roman casualties during the 11 and 12 AD campaigns, while significantly lower than the Teutoburg losses, accumulated to levels that created recruitment challenges and morale problems throughout the imperial military system. Germanic tactical effectiveness in forest warfare conditions continued to inflict disproportionate losses on Roman forces whose training and equipment had been optimized for Mediterranean operational environments. The persistent casualty rates, combined with limited territorial gains, created political pressures in Rome where Augustus faced criticism for continuing expensive military operations that produced minimal strategic results. The 12 AD campaign marked Tiberius's final attempt to achieve decisive military results through large-scale offensive operations designed to force Germanic tribes into conventional battles where Roman organizational advantages could prove decisive. Roman forces, totaling nearly 50,000 troops including 8 legions and extensive auxiliary support, conducted coordinated advances from multiple directions intended to prevent Germanic forces from employing their preferred withdrawal tactics. This massive military effort represented the largest Roman army ever assembled for Germanic operations, demonstrating imperial commitment to resolving the Germanic crisis through overwhelming force application. Germanic responses to Roman offensive pressure revealed strategic planning that anticipated Roman tactical approaches, while preparing defensive measures that could neutralize Roman numerical and technological advantages. Tribal forces avoided the kind of decisive battles that Roman commanders sought, instead employing strategic withdrawal tactics that drew Roman armies deeper into unfavourable terrain, while maintaining pressure through continued harassment operations. This strategic approach demonstrated Germanic recognition that prolonged warfare would eventually exhaust Roman resources, while tribal forces could sustain resistance operations indefinitely within their native territories. The conclusion of Tiberius's Germanic campaigns in 12 AD marks the effective abandonment of Augustus's territorial expansion objectives east of the Rhine, as Roman strategic planning shifted toward defensive consolidation that accepted Germanic independence, while attempting to prevent tribal raids against established Roman territories. The enormous financial costs of 3 years of intensive military operations, combined with limited territorial gains and continued Germanic military effectiveness, created political pressures that forced reconsideration of imperial expansion policies that had guided Roman strategic planning for the previous generation. The appointment of Germanicus to Germanic command in 13 AD represented Augustus's final attempt to achieve military success that could restore Roman prestige while providing psychological compensation for the Teutoburg disaster. Germanicus brought to the assignment youth, energy and family connections that provided political advantages. but his military experience remained limited compared to the veteran commanders who had struggled unsuccessfully against Germanic tactical capabilities during previous campaign seasons. His appointment reflected political considerations rather than purely military qualifications, indicating that Germanic operations had become as much about Roman domestic politics as strategic objectives. The military resources allocated to Germanicus exceeded even those provided to Tiberius, including specialized units recruited specifically for Germanic operations and equipment designed to address the tactical challenges that had limited Roman effectiveness during previous campaigns. Roman quartermasters stockpiled supplies for extended operations, while engineers prepared construction materials for road building and fortification projects intended to create permanent Roman presence in Germanic territories. These preparations indicated continued Roman determination to achieve territorial control despite previous military setbacks. Germanicus's 14 AD campaign emphasized rapid movements and surprise attacks, designed to achieve tactical success before Germanic forces could implement the coordinated defensive measures that had proven so effective against previous Roman operations. Roman cavalry units conducted deep reconnaissance missions that provided intelligence about Germanic military dispositions, while identifying potential targets for surprise attacks. These operations achieved limited tactical success through capturing isolated Germanic settlements and recovering some of the military standards lost during the Teutoburg disaster, providing psychological benefits that partially compensated for continued strategic frustrations. The recovery of legionary eagles from Germanic custody became a central objective of Germanicus's campaigns, since these military symbols represented Roman honour and their loss created morale problems throughout the imperial military system. Intelligence operations identified Germanic locations where captured Roman equipment was being held, enabling targeted raids that achieved symbolic victories while demonstrating continued Roman military capabilities. The recovery of the 18th Legion's Eagle during a raid against a Bructeri settlement provided propaganda material that helped restore Roman military confidence while demonstrating that Germanic forces could not maintain security for their captured prizes. Germanic responses to Germanicus's operations revealed continued tactical innovation and strategic coordination that maintained tribal military effectiveness despite intensified Roman pressure. Arminius's leadership had evolved to encompass strategic planning that anticipated Roman operational patterns while coordinating defensive measures across multiple tribal territories. Germanic forces employed strategic deception operations that provided false intelligence to Roman reconnaissance units, creating opportunities for ambush attacks that continued to inflict significant casualties on Roman forces operating in unfamiliar terrain. The transformation of Arminius from local tribal leader to pan-Germanic resistance symbol reflected the psychological impact of sustained military success against Roman forces whose invincibility had been accepted throughout the Mediterranean world. Germanic tribal populations that had never previously cooperated in large-scale military operations began coordinating their activities under Arminius's strategic guidance, creating defensive capabilities that transcended traditional tribal boundaries while maintaining the tactical flexibility that had proven so effective against Roman organizational methods. The aftermath of the Teutoburg forest victory created unprecedented opportunities for Germanic military coordination, but it also exposed Arminius to the complex challenges of maintaining tribal unity in the face of sustained Roman military pressure and internal political tensions that threatened to fragment the alliance he'd so carefully constructed. Germanicus's appointment to the Germanic command in 13 AD brought fresh Roman tactical approaches and substantially increased military resources that would test Germanic defensive capabilities while creating new strategic pressures that required constant adaptation of tribal military organization and political coordination. Germanicus arrived in Germania with 8 legions plus extensive auxiliary support, representing the largest Roman military commitment to the region since Augustus's initial expansion efforts. The Futgi Germanica and V. Alaudae legions brought veteran experience from Pannonian campaigns, where Roman forces had developed specialised techniques for forest warfare, while the newly recruited Wobin Rapax provided fresh manpower specifically trained for Germanic operations. The auxiliary contingent included Gallic cavalry squadrons, whose linguistic abilities facilitated intelligence gathering among Germanic populations, plus Balearic slingers and Syrian archers whose projectile capabilities had been enhanced through specialised training designed to counter Germanic tactical advantages in dense woodland terrain. The Roman strategic approach under Germanicus emphasised rapid, coordinated strikes designed to achieve tactical surprise before Germanic forces could implement the defensive coordination that had proven so effective during previous campaigns. Roman intelligence operations significantly expanded through recruitment of additional Germanic informants and systematic interrogation of captured tribal members, provided detailed information about Arminius's alliance structure and the logistical networks that sustained Germanic military operations across multiple tribal territories. This intelligence enabled Roman commanders to identify specific targets whose destruction could disrupt Germanic coordination, while achieving psychological victories that would restore Roman military prestige. The 14 AD campaign season opened with simultaneous Roman advances from multiple Rhine crossing points, creating tactical pressure that prevented Germanic forces from concentrating their defensive efforts against any single Roman column. The northern advance, led by Germanicus personally with 4 legions plus auxiliary support, crossed the Rhine near modern Cologne and proceeded eastward along the Lippe River valley toward Bructeri territory. The southern column, commanded by Aulus Caecina Severus with 3 legions, advanced through Chatti territory toward the Weser River, while a third force under Lucius Stertinius conducted amphibious operations along the North Sea coast to establish supply bases that could support extended Roman operations in Germanic interior regions. Germanic responses to this multi-pronged Roman offensive revealed the sophisticated defensive planning that Arminius had developed during the winter months following the Teutoburg victory. Rather than attempting to defend all tribal territories simultaneously, Germanic forces implemented strategic withdrawal tactics that drew Roman columns deeper into unfavourable terrain while maintaining coordinated harassment operations that inflicted casualties and disrupted Roman supply lines. Tribal populations evacuated their settlements in advance of Roman approaches, removing livestock and portable wealth, while destroying agricultural stores that might support Roman occupation forces. The Battle of Pontes Longi in 15 AD demonstrated both the evolution of Germanic tactical capabilities and the persistent challenges that Roman forces faced when operating in terrain that negated their organisational advantages. The engagement occurred when Caecina's column, returning from a successful raid against Chatti settlements, encountered a coordinated Germanic ambush at a series of wooden causeways crossing marshy terrain near the Ems River. The location provided Germanic forces with optimal conditions for employing their traditional tactics, elevated positions that enabled effective archery, while the marshy ground prevented Roman formation deployment and limited cavalry operations that might otherwise provide tactical mobility. Arminius had selected the Pontes Longi position after careful reconnaissance revealed Roman operational patterns and identified the most likely withdrawal routes that Roman forces would employ following their raids against Germanic settlements. The causeway crossings created natural choke points where Roman columns would be most vulnerable, while Germanic forces could achieve maximum tactical coordination. Tribal engineers had modified the wooden bridge structures to create additional defensive advantages, weakening support timbers that could collapse under the weight of Roman heavy equipment, while preparing concealed positions that enabled Germanic warriors to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The Germanic force assembled for the Pontes Longi ambush totaled approximately 8,000 warriors drawn from Cherusci, Bructeri, and Chauci tribes, whose coordination reflected the military alliance structure that Arminius had developed following the Teutoburg success. Cherusci forces, numbering roughly 3,000 experienced fighters, occupied elevated positions overlooking the primary causeway crossing, where their archery capabilities could achieve maximum effectiveness against Roman troops forced to advance in narrow column formation. Bructeri warriors, approximately 2,500 strong, positioned themselves along the flanking approaches where their knowledge of local terrain enabled them to exploit alternative routes for attacking Roman supply trains and rearguard elements. The Chauci contingent, consisting of nearly 2,500 warriors plus specialised naval units operating shallow draft vessels, provided tactical mobility that enabled coordinated attacks against Roman positions while maintaining secure withdrawal routes if the engagement developed unfavourably for Germanic forces. Their naval capabilities proved particularly valuable for transporting weapons and supplies to forward positions while evacuating wounded Germanic fighters to secure medical treatment facilities established in concealed locations throughout the marshy terrain surrounding the engagement area. Roman tactical responses to the Pontes Longi ambush demonstrated both the professional competence of imperial military units and the limitations of standard Roman procedures when applied to environmental conditions that prevented optimal deployment of organisational capabilities. Caecina's legions attempted to establish defensive formations according to established tactical doctrine, but the narrow confines of the causeway approaches prevented proper unit spacing, while Germanic archery from elevated positions created casualties that disrupted formation integrity before effective defensive arrangements could be completed. The Roman engineering response to Germanic defensive positions revealed innovative tactical adaptation that incorporated lessons learned from previous Germanic campaigns. Roman pioneers, working under covering fire from Balearic slingers whose accuracy exceeded Germanic archery capabilities at extended ranges, constructed temporary fortifications using materials salvaged from damaged causeway structures. These defensive works provided Roman forces with secure positions from which they could coordinate counterattacks while protecting supply trains and wounded personnel from continued Germanic harassment operations. Roman artillery deployment at Pontes Longi marked the first effective use of siege equipment in Germanic forest warfare, as Roman engineers positioned ballistas and scorpions to provide suppressive fire against Germanic positions that had previously been immune to Roman projectile weapons. The mechanical artillery achieved accuracy and penetration capabilities that exceeded Germanic defensive preparations, forcing tribal warriors to abandon exposed positions while creating opportunities for Roman infantry advances that might otherwise have been impossible under sustained Germanic archery pressure. The tactical evolution evident during the Pontes Longi engagement reflected systematic adaptation by both Roman and Germanic forces to the specific challenges created by forest warfare conditions. Germanic forces had developed improved coordination techniques that enabled more effective integration of diverse tribal military units, while Roman commanders had modified standard tactical procedures to achieve greater effectiveness in terrain that had previously negated imperial organisational advantages. The engagement demonstrated that both sides possessed the tactical flexibility necessary for continued adaptation to evolving battlefield conditions. Germanic casualties during the Pontes Longi engagement totaled approximately 1,200 killed or wounded, representing the heaviest losses sustained by Arminius's forces since the formation of the anti-Roman alliance. The casualties were distributed unevenly among participating tribal units, with Cherusci forces suffering the highest losses due to their exposure to Roman artillery fire that had not been anticipated during tactical planning. Bructeri and Chauci casualties remained relatively light due to their tactical roles that emphasised mobility and withdrawal capabilities, rather than sustained defensive positions. Roman losses at Pontes Longi exceeded 2,000 casualties, including approximately 400 killed, representing significant attrition for professional military units whose replacement required extensive training and transportation from Mediterranean recruitment centres. The casualties included disproportionate losses among centurions and other experienced non-commissioned officers whose leadership skills proved crucial for maintaining unit effectiveness under challenging battlefield conditions. These personnel losses created command problems that affected Roman tactical capabilities during subsequent campaign operations. The strategic implications of the Pontes Longi engagement extended beyond immediate tactical results to influence broader Germanic political relationships and Roman strategic planning for continued operations in tribal territories. Germanic military success, while costly in terms of casualties, demonstrated continued tribal capability for inflicting significant losses on Roman forces while maintaining coordinated defensive operations across multiple tribal territories. The engagement provided psychological benefits that reinforced tribal commitment to continued resistance while demonstrating that Roman tactical adaptations had not eliminated Germanic military effectiveness. Roman strategic assessments following Pontes Longi revealed growing recognition that Germanic military capabilities required fundamental changes in imperial tactical doctrine and resource allocation for operations in tribal territories. The systematic Germanic defensive coordination observed during the engagement indicated sophisticated military planning that transcended traditional tribal organizational limitations, creating strategic challenges that could not be resolved through conventional Roman military methods. Germanicus's subsequent campaign planning reflected these assessments through increased emphasis on logistics, engineering support, and specialized equipment designed specifically for Germanic operational conditions. The Battle of Idistaviso in 16 AD represented Germanicus's attempt to force Germanic forces into the kind of open-field engagement where Roman organizational advantages could achieve decisive tactical results. The battle location, near the Weser River in territory controlled by the Cherusci Confederation, provided terrain conditions that favoured Roman formation fighting while limiting Germanic opportunities for employing the forest ambush tactics that had proven so effective during previous engagements. Roman intelligence operations had identified the location as a seasonal gathering place for tribal assemblies, suggesting that Germanic forces might be compelled to defend the position rather than employing their preferred strategic withdrawal tactics. The Roman force assembled for the Idistaviso operation totaled approximately 35,000 troops, including 6 legions plus extensive auxiliary support drawn from throughout the empire's frontier regions. The Fey and XX legions provided veteran heavy infantry, whose experience in previous Germanic campaigns offered crucial tactical knowledge for operations against tribal forces employing traditional weapons and fighting techniques. Auxiliary cavalry units, recruited primarily from Gallic territories, contributed mobility capabilities essential for preventing Germanic withdrawal, while providing reconnaissance support for Roman tactical planning. Germanic defensive preparations at Idistaviso reflected Arminius's recognition that strategic withdrawal tactics, while effective for avoiding decisive defeat, could not indefinitely prevent Roman forces from achieving their territorial and psychological objectives through systematic destruction of tribal settlements and agricultural resources. The decision to accept battle at Idistaviso represented calculated risk-taking designed to achieve tactical results that could restore Germanic military initiative while demonstrating continued tribal capability for confronting Roman forces under conditions that favoured imperial military advantages. The Germanic force defending the Idistaviso position totaled approximately 15,000 warriors, representing the largest concentration of tribal military power since the Teutoburg forest engagement. Cherusci forces provided the core strength with roughly 6,000 experienced fighters organised into traditional clan-based units that retained their indigenous tactical knowledge while incorporating lessons learned from previous engagements with Roman forces. Bructeri and Chatti contingents contributed an additional 4,000 warriors whose specialised capabilities complemented Cherusci strengths while providing tactical diversity that could adapt to changing battlefield conditions. The remaining Germanic strength consisted of smaller tribal contingents whose participation reflected the broader political alliance that Arminius had constructed through diplomatic efforts extending throughout the region's diverse tribal populations. These forces included Angrivari warriors whose knowledge of local terrain provided crucial intelligence support, plus Chauci naval units whose shallow draft vessels enabled tactical mobility along the Weser River that could threaten Roman flanks or provide secure withdrawal routes if battlefield conditions developed unfavourably for Germanic defensive operations. Roman tactical deployment at Idistaviso followed standard imperial doctrine for engaging tribal opponents in open terrain, with legionary heavy infantry forming the centre of the battle line, while auxiliary cavalry protected the flanks and provided tactical mobility for exploiting breakthrough opportunities. Germanic positions occupied elevated ground overlooking the river valley, providing defensive advantages that partially compensated for Roman numerical superiority, while enabling effective use of Germanic archery capabilities against Roman formations, advancing across predictable approach routes. The engagement commenced with Roman artillery bombardment designed to disrupt Germanic defensive positions, while creating psychological pressure that might induce premature tribal attacks against prepared Roman positions. Ballistas and scorpions, positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, achieved accuracy against Germanic positions that exceeded tribal defensive preparations. The mechanical artillery created casualties among Germanic warriors while forcing tactical adjustments that disrupted coordinated defensive planning. Germanic responses to Roman artillery pressure demonstrated tactical innovation that incorporated counter-battery techniques previously unknown in tribal military traditions. Germanic engineers, working under covering fire from tribal archers, constructed mobile shields using captured Roman equipment and local materials that provided protection for warriors advancing against Roman artillery positions. These improvised defensive measures enabled Germanic forces to maintain coordinated attacks despite continued Roman artillery pressure. The main infantry engagement at Idistaviso revealed both the strengths and limitations of opposing tactical systems when applied to terrain conditions that provided neither side with decisive environmental advantages. Roman legionary formations achieved superior coordination and equipment advantages that proved effective against Germanic individual combat techniques, while tribal warriors demonstrated mobility and tactical flexibility that enabled them to exploit gaps in Roman defensive arrangements. The engagement developed into sustained close-quarters fighting that tested the endurance and tactical adaptability of both military systems. Roman cavalry operations during the Idistaviso engagement achieved limited success due to Germanic defensive preparations that anticipated Roman tactical procedures while creating countermeasures designed to neutralize imperial mobility advantages. Germanic forces had prepared concealed obstacles and defensive positions that channeled Roman cavalry movements into predetermined killing zones, where tribal spear formations could achieve maximum effectiveness against mounted opponents. These defensive arrangements demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Roman tactical capabilities and systematic preparation for countering imperial military advantages. The tactical climax of the Idistaviso engagement occurred when Germanicus personally led a cavalry charge against Germanic positions that had been weakened by sustained Roman artillery, bombardment, and infantry pressure. The Roman breakthrough achieved temporary tactical success that created opportunities for exploiting Germanic defensive vulnerabilities, but tribal forces demonstrated remarkable tactical resilience through coordinated counterattacks that restored defensive integrity while inflicting significant casualties on Roman units that had advanced beyond mutual support range. Germanic withdrawal from the Idistaviso battlefield proceeded according to predetermined tactical plans that preserved the majority of tribal military strength while achieving strategic objectives that transcended immediate tactical results. Arminius had recognized that prolonged engagement under conditions favoring Roman organizational advantages would inevitably result in decisive Germanic defeat, making strategic withdrawal essential for preserving tribal military capabilities for continued resistance operations. The withdrawal demonstrated sophisticated tactical coordination that enabled Germanic forces to disengage from close combat while maintaining unit integrity sufficient for continued military operations. The recovery of the 68th Legion's Eagle during the Idista Visso engagement provided Germanicus with crucial propaganda material that partially compensated for the strategic frustrations that continued to characterize Roman operations in Germanic territories. The legionary standard had been captured during the Teutoburg disaster and held in a sacred grove that served as a focal point for Germanic resistance activities. Its recovery demonstrated continued Roman military capabilities while providing symbolic victory that helped restore imperial military prestige among Roman troops whose confidence had been shaken by previous Germanic tactical successes. The internal Germanic political tensions that emerged following the Idista Visso engagement reflected the complex challenges that Arminius faced in maintaining tribal unity while adapting to evolving strategic pressures created by sustained Roman military operations. Traditional Germanic political structures emphasized individual tribal autonomy and consensual decision-making that complicated efforts to achieve the centralized coordination necessary for effective resistance against Roman organizational capabilities. The casualties sustained during recent engagements had created leadership gaps within participating tribes while generating debates about the costs and benefits of continued military resistance. Inguiomerus, Arminius's uncle and a prominent Cheruscan war leader, emerged as the focal point for Germanic political opposition to continued resistance operations that were producing significant tribal casualties without achieving decisive strategic results. His criticism reflected broader concerns among Germanic leaders about the sustainability of military operations that required unprecedented tribal coordination while exposing traditional settlements to Roman retaliation. The political tensions created by these concerns threatened to fragment the alliance structure that provided the foundation for Germanic military effectiveness against Roman forces. The debate within Germanic leadership circles revealed fundamental disagreements about strategic objectives and tactical methods that reflected different assessments of Roman military capabilities and the long-term prospects for successful tribal resistance. Conservative tribal leaders advocated for negotiated settlements that could preserve tribal autonomy while avoiding the casualties associated with continued military operations, while supporters of continued resistance emphasized the psychological and political benefits of maintaining military pressure against Roman territorial ambitions. The growing opposition to Arminius among Germanic nobles who viewed his power as excessive created fractures within the tribal confederation that threatened to undermine everything he had achieved since the Teutoburg victory. Traditional Germanic political structures had never been designed to accommodate the kind of centralized authority that sustained military resistance against Rome required, and the success of coordinated operations had paradoxically created new sources of internal tension as individual tribal leaders found their traditional autonomy constrained by strategic necessities. The most significant challenge came from within his own family, as Inguiomerus, his uncle and a respected Cheruscan war leader, began expressing reservations about the direction of Arminius's leadership that would eventually evolve into open opposition. Inguiomerus commanded substantial influence within Cheruscan political circles through his reputation as a veteran warrior who had participated in tribal conflicts long before Roman expansion became a dominant concern. His military experience included successful raids against neighbouring tribes during territorial disputes that had established Cheruscan dominance over crucial river valley settlements, while his knowledge of traditional Germanic warfare techniques provided credibility when he criticised the tactical innovations that Arminius had implemented during recent campaigns against Roman forces. The respect that other tribal leaders accorded to Inguiomerus' military judgment made his growing skepticism about continued resistance operations particularly dangerous to Arminius' authority. The fundamental disagreement between uncle and nephew centered on strategic objectives and the acceptable costs of achieving Germanic independence from Roman control. Inguiomerus advocated for negotiated settlement with Roman authorities that could preserve essential tribal autonomy while avoiding the casualties and economic disruption associated with prolonged military operations. His position reflected traditional Germanic political wisdom that emphasized pragmatic accommodation with superior enemies when continued resistance threatened tribal survival. This conservative approach had enabled Germanic tribes to maintain their independence for generations through careful balance between resistance and accommodation that preserved essential cultural and political institutions. Arminius' response to his uncle's opposition revealed the psychological pressures created by leadership responsibilities that extended far beyond traditional tribal boundaries. The coordination of multiple tribal military forces required decision-making authority that conflicted with Germanic consensual political traditions, while the strategic planning necessary for effective resistance operations demanded secrecy that prevented the kind of open deliberation that legitimized traditional tribal leadership. The success of anti-Roman operations had created expectations for continued military achievements that placed enormous pressure on Arminius to maintain tactical effectiveness while managing increasingly complex political relationships among allied tribal leaders. The political fragmentation that began emerging within the Germanic alliance reflected deeper tensions between traditional tribal values and the organizational requirements necessary for sustained military operations against Roman forces. Individual tribal chiefs who had initially supported coordinated resistance efforts began questioning whether continued cooperation served their specific tribal interests, particularly as Roman retaliation operations targeted tribal settlements and agricultural resources that provided the foundation for community survival. The casualties sustained during recent engagements had created leadership gaps within participating tribes while generating debates about the wisdom of continued military resistance that produced significant losses without achieving decisive strategic results. The conflict with tribal leaders who favoured accommodation with Rome intensified as Roman diplomatic efforts systematically exploited Germanic political divisions through targeted incentives designed to reward cooperation while punishing continued resistance. Roman administrators offered favourable trading terms, territorial guarantees, and military protection to tribal leaders who agreed to abandon the anti-Roman alliance, creating economic and security incentives that competed with the psychological benefits of continued independence. These diplomatic initiatives proved particularly effective with smaller tribes whose military contributions to the Germanic alliance were limited, but whose defection could create strategic vulnerabilities that Roman forces might exploit during future campaign operations. The Marcomanni, under their chief Maroboduus, represented the most significant potential ally whose support could have fundamentally altered the strategic balance between Germanic and Roman forces. Maroboduus commanded approximately 70,000 warriors organized into disciplined units that employed tactical coordination superior to most Germanic military formations, while his kingdom's geographic position in Bohemian territories provided strategic depth that could support sustained resistance operations even if Rhine frontier regions fell under Roman control. However, Maroboduus maintained careful neutrality toward the anti-Roman alliance, despite diplomatic overtures from Arminius, preferring to preserve his kingdom's independence through strategic balance rather than committing to military operations that might invite Roman retaliation. The failure to secure Marcomanni alliance reflected broader challenges that Arminius faced in expanding Germanic political cooperation beyond the immediate Rhine frontier region, where Roman territorial ambitions created obvious threats to tribal independence. distant tribal leaders possessed limited direct experience with Roman administrative methods and military capabilities, making them less susceptible to appeals based on resistance to imperial expansion. Their geographic isolation from Roman territories provided security that reduced their incentives for accepting the risks associated with coordinated military operations, while their existing political relationships often conflicted with the alliance structures that Arminius was attempting to establish. The personal struggles that accompanied Arminius's political responsibilities intensified dramatically with the capture of his pregnant wife Thusnelda by Germanicus during Roman operations in 15 AD. Thusnelda's seizure occurred during a coordinated Roman raid against a Cheruscan settlement where she had been residing with other tribal leaders' families who were considered secure from Roman military operations due to the location's distance from established Roman bases. Roman intelligence operations, significantly enhanced through recruitment of Germanic informants and systematic interrogation of captured tribal members, had identified the settlement as a high-value target whose capture could achieve both tactical and psychological advantages against Germanic leadership. Thusnelda represented far more than a personal loss for Arminius. Her capture eliminated a crucial political asset whose family connections and personal influence had helped maintain Cheruscan unity during periods of internal disagreement about resistance strategies. Her father, Segestes, had maintained ambivalent attitudes toward the anti-Roman alliance despite his daughter's marriage to Arminius, creating political tensions within Cheruscan leadership that threatened tribal participation in coordinated military operations. Thusnelda's diplomatic skills and cultural knowledge had proven essential for managing these internal political challenges while maintaining the family relationships that provided legitimacy for Arminius's leadership role within traditional Germanic political structures. The psychological impact of Thusnelda's capture extended beyond immediate personal grief to create strategic vulnerabilities that Roman forces could exploit through propaganda operations designed to undermine Germanic morale and political cohesion. Roman administrators publicized her treatment as an honored prisoner whose comfortable circumstances demonstrated imperial clemency toward Germanic populations who accepted Roman authority, while simultaneously suggesting that continued resistance would result in similar separations of tribal leaders from their families. These propaganda efforts proved particularly effective among Germanic women, whose influence over tribal political decisions often proved crucial during debates about war and peace. The birth of Thusnelda's son Thumelicus while in Roman custody created additional emotional pressures for Arminius, while providing Roman authorities with leverage that could be employed during future diplomatic negotiations. The child's Roman upbringing would ensure his cultural assimilation according to imperial educational methods, potentially creating a future Germanic leader whose loyalties would align with Roman rather than tribal interests. This long-term, strategic approach reflected Roman understanding of Germanic political structures and their recognition that psychological pressure on tribal leaders could prove more effective than purely military solutions for achieving imperial territorial objectives. The capture also revealed security vulnerabilities within Germanic intelligence networks that had previously provided effective protection for tribal leadership families and strategic planning activities. Roman forces had acquired detailed information about Cheruscan settlement locations and defensive preparations through sources whose identities remained unknown to tribal security personnel, indicating systematic penetration of Germanic political and military organizations by Roman intelligence operatives. These security breaches threatened the operational security that had enabled successful coordination of tribal military activities while creating uncertainty about the reliability of information sharing within the Germanic alliance structure. Roman exploitation of Thusnelda's capture through diplomatic channels revealed sophisticated understanding of Germanic political psychology and the personal relationships that influenced tribal decision-making processes. Segestes, whose opposition to his daughter's marriage had created family tensions, that paralleled broader political divisions within Cheruscan leadership became a focal point for Roman efforts to fragment Germanic political unity through targeted incentives and psychological pressure. Roman administrators offered him guarantees for his daughter's safety and eventual reunion with her family in exchange for cooperation with imperial authorities and withdrawal of Cheruscan support for continued military resistance. The assessment of political fragmentation within the Germanic alliance revealed systematic erosion of tribal cooperation that threatened the military effectiveness that had enabled successful resistance operations against Roman forces. Individual tribal leaders who had initially supported coordinated resistance efforts began pursuing independent negotiations with Roman authorities, seeking favourable terms that could preserve their specific tribal interests while avoiding the casualties and economic disruption associated with continued military operations. These defections created strategic vulnerabilities that Roman forces could exploit through divide-and-conquer tactics that had proven effective in other frontier regions, where tribal resistance had initially appeared formidable. The Chauci, whose coastal territories had provided crucial strategic advantages for Germanic military operations, began demonstrating reduced enthusiasm for continued participation in anti-Roman activities as Roman naval operations increased pressure on their maritime trade networks and fishing communities. Their geographic position made them particularly vulnerable to Roman retaliation through naval blockades and amphibious assault operations that could devastate coastal settlements while remaining beyond the reach of Germanic land-based military support. The gradual withdrawal of Chauci military contributions reduced Germanic tactical capabilities while eliminating access to naval resources that had proven essential for coordinating attacks against Roman supply lines. The challenges of maintaining anti-Roman unity intensified as economic pressures created by prolonged military operations began affecting tribal communities whose survival depended on agricultural production and commercial exchange networks that Roman military activities had systematically disrupted. Germanic settlements had been forced to relocate away from traditional territories to avoid Roman retaliation, creating refugee populations whose support required resources that participating tribes could ill afford during periods of sustained military mobilization. The economic burden of supporting displaced populations while maintaining military forces in the field created internal tensions that threatened tribal commitment to continued resistance operations. Traditional Germanic legal and political institutions proved inadequate for managing the complex coordination requirements that sustained military resistance demanded, creating administrative challenges that strained tribal leadership capabilities while generating conflicts between traditional authority structures and the centralized decision-making that military effectiveness required. Tribal assemblies that had previously provided consensual legitimacy for political decisions became forums for expressing disagreement about strategic objectives and tactical methods, while the secrecy necessary for military planning conflicted with Germanic traditions of open deliberation that validated leadership authority through community participation. The evolution of Arminius's leadership style in response to these political pressures created additional sources of internal tension as traditional Germanic concepts of consensual authority conflicted with the autocratic decision-making that military coordination required. His increasing reliance on personal loyalty relationships, rather than traditional tribal political structures, alienated established leaders whose authority derived from hereditary claims and community recognition rather than military achievement. These political tensions reflected broader cultural conflicts between traditional Germanic social organization and the institutional innovations necessary for effective resistance against Roman imperial expansion. The systematic Roman exploitation of Germanic political divisions through targeted diplomatic initiatives revealed imperial understanding of tribal psychology and the personal relationships that influence political decision-making within Germanic communities. Roman administrators identified specific tribal leaders whose cooperation could be secured through appropriate incentives while simultaneously applying military pressure against communities that continued supporting anti-Roman activities. This sophisticated approach combined economic incentives, security guarantees, and psychological pressure to create conditions that made continued resistance increasingly difficult to sustain, while offering attractive alternatives that preserved essential tribal interests through accommodation with imperial authority. The internal debates about strategic objectives that emerged within Germanic leadership circles reflected fundamental disagreements about the long-term prospects for successful tribal resistance and the acceptable costs of achieving independence from Roman control. Conservative tribal leaders advocated for negotiated settlements that could preserve essential tribal autonomy while avoiding the casualties and economic disruption associated with continued military operations, while supporters of continued resistance emphasized the psychological and political benefits of maintaining military pressure against Roman territorial ambitions. These strategic disagreements created political divisions that threatened the alliance structure that provided the foundation for Germanic military effectiveness against Roman forces. The personal toll that leadership responsibilities exacted on Arminius became increasingly evident as political pressures intensified and military challenges multiplied beyond the capabilities of traditional Germanic institutional structures to manage effectively. The psychological burden of coordinating complex military operations while managing internal political conflicts and personal losses created stress that affected his decision-making capabilities and relationships with tribal leaders, whose continued cooperation remained essential for maintaining resistance operations. The isolation that accompanied his elevated position within Germanic political hierarchies eliminated many of the personal relationships that had previously provided emotional support and political guidance during challenging periods. The growing autocratic tendencies that characterized Arminius's leadership during the final years of his life created irreparable divisions within Germanic society that would ultimately lead to his assassination by members of his own tribe in 21 AD. The man who had once embodied Germanic resistance to Roman domination found himself increasingly isolated from the traditional tribal structures that had originally legitimized his authority, as the demands of coordinating sustained military operations against imperial forces required decision-making processes that conflicted fundamentally with Germanic consensual political traditions. His transformation from liberator to autocrat reflected the impossible tensions between maintaining effective resistance leadership and preserving the democratic institutions that defined Germanic cultural identity. The specific grievances that motivated Arminius's assassination centered on his systematic undermining of traditional Cheruscan political institutions in favor of personal rule that bypassed established tribal councils and ignored customary consultation procedures. Tribal elders who had initially supported his anti-Roman activities became increasingly concerned about his tendency to make unilateral decisions affecting tribal military commitments, territorial agreements, and resource allocation without seeking the consensus that Germanic law required for legitimate governance. His establishment of a personal bodyguard composed of warriors whose primary loyalty was to him rather than to the tribe violated fundamental principles of Germanic political organization that emphasized collective leadership and shared authority among established family groups. The conspiracy against Arminius developed gradually among Cheruscan nobles who viewed his concentration of power as a threat to their traditional privileges and their families' hereditary claims to political influence within tribal decision-making structures. The plotters included Segima's younger brother, whose name Roman sources do not preserve but whose opposition reflected broader family tensions about Arminius's leadership style and strategic objectives. Additional conspirators represented established warrior families whose military traditions predated Roman expansion and whose authority derived from generations of service to Cheruscan political institutions rather than personal loyalty to individual leaders. The assassination occurred during a tribal assembly convened to discuss responses to renewed Roman diplomatic overtures that offered favourable terms for Cheruscan withdrawal from anti-Roman activities. Roman administrators, recognising that Arminius's death would eliminate the primary obstacle to Germanic political fragmentation, had systematically encouraged internal tribal opposition through carefully targeted intelligence operations that provided information about his political vulnerabilities, while avoiding direct Roman involvement that might unite Germanic tribes against imperial interference. The timing of the attack reflected careful coordination between Germanic conspirators and Roman intelligence networks that had identified the optimal moment for eliminating their primary adversary. The method of assassination employed traditional Germanic execution procedures for individuals convicted of treason against tribal interests, involving multiple attackers who used ceremonial weapons to ensure that responsibility was shared among the conspirators rather than attributed to any single individual. The attack occurred within the sacred grove where tribal assemblies traditionally met, a location chosen to demonstrate that Arminius's death represented legitimate tribal justice, rather than personal vendetta or foreign manipulation. The ritualistic aspects of the assassination reflected Germanic legal traditions, while simultaneously serving practical purposes by preventing any single conspirator from being identified as the primary assassin who might face retaliation from Arminius's remaining supporters. Contemporary accounts describe Arminius as approximately 37 years old at the time of his death, having spent nearly 2 decades navigating the complex political and military challenges created by Roman expansion into Germanic territories. His physical appearance reflected the warrior culture that had shaped his development. Tall and powerfully built according to Germanic standards, with battle scars that testified to his personal participation in the combat operations he commanded, and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, but also marked by the psychological pressures of sustained leadership during periods of constant military and political crisis. His death eliminated not only a military commander, but a political innovator whose efforts to create pan-Germanic unity had represented the most significant challenge to Roman territorial ambition since the conquest of Gaul. The immediate political consequences of Arminius's assassination created precisely the fragmentation that Roman administrators had hoped to achieve through their systematic exploitation of Germanic internal tensions. Without his personal authority to maintain coordination between diverse tribal groups, the anti-Roman alliance rapidly dissolved, as individual tribes pursued separate negotiations with imperial authorities or withdrew entirely from political activities that might attract Roman retaliation. The Cherusci themselves split into competing factions that supported different approaches to Roman relations, eliminating their effectiveness as leaders of broader Germanic resistance, while creating opportunities for Roman diplomatic intervention that could prevent future coordination of tribal military activities. Inguiomerus, despite his previous opposition to his nephew's autocratic tendencies, recognised that Arminius's death represented a catastrophic loss for Germanic independence and attempted to maintain some form of coordinated resistance through alliance with Maroboduus and the Marcomanni kingdom. However, these efforts failed to recreate the military effectiveness that had characterised the original anti-Roman coalition, as participating tribes lacked the shared leadership and strategic vision that Arminius had provided despite his political shortcomings. The fragmented resistance efforts that continued sporadically throughout the 20s AD achieved limited tactical success, while failing to present the kind of systematic challenge to Roman authority that might have prevented imperial consolidation of territorial gains. The collapse of unified Germanic resistance enabled Roman forces to implement systematic pacification policies that had been impossible while Arminius's coalition maintained military pressure against imperial installations and supply networks. Roman administrators re-established control over territories that had been abandoned following the Teutoburg disaster constructing new fortifications and administrative centres that provided secure bases for governing Germanic populations, according to imperial legal and economic systems. The Rhine frontier became permanently established as the boundary between Roman and Germanic territories, ending Augustus's expansion objectives while creating the stable frontier that would characterize imperial policy for the next 4 centuries. The historical legacy of Arminius began developing almost immediately after his death through the writings of Roman historians, who recognized his significance as both a military opponent and a symbol of resistance to imperial expansion. Tacitus, writing approximately a century after the events, provided the most detailed and influential account of Arminius's career in his Annales and Germania, works that established the interpretive framework through which subsequent generations would understand the Germanic wars and their broader significance for Roman imperial development. Tacitus's portrayal emphasized Arminius's role as liberator of Germania, while acknowledging the internal political tensions that ultimately led to his downfall, creating a complex historical narrative that recognized both his achievements and his limitations as a political leader. Tacitus's famous characterization of Arminius as unquestionably the liberator of Germania reflected Roman recognition that his military and political activities had permanently altered the strategic balance between imperial and tribal territories, establishing limits to Roman expansion that would persist throughout the imperial period. The historian's analysis emphasized the psychological impact of Germanic military success against professional Roman armies, noting that the Teutoburg victory had demonstrated the vulnerability of imperial forces when operating under conditions that negated their organizational and technological advantages. This assessment influenced Roman strategic planning for centuries, contributing to the defensive orientation that characterized imperial frontier policies after the Flavian period. The preservation of Arminius's memory within Germanic oral tradition created cultural narratives that emphasized his role as defender of tribal independence against foreign domination, themes that resonated with subsequent generations who faced similar challenges from various imperial powers. Germanic bards and storytellers maintained traditions that celebrated his military achievements while acknowledging the tragic circumstances of his death, creating heroic narratives that provided cultural models for resistance leadership during periods of external threat. These oral traditions preserved essential elements of his historical significance, even as political circumstances changed and Germanic tribal structures evolved under pressure from Roman, Hunnic, and other foreign influences. The medieval rediscovery of Tacitus's writings during the Renaissance created renewed interest in Arminius as a historical figure whose career provided insights into ancient Germanic culture and the dynamics of resistance to imperial expansion. Humanist scholars recognized the relevance of his story to contemporary political situations where emerging nation-states confronted imperial powers, while Protestant reformers found in his resistance to Roman authority parallels to their own challenges to papal political influence. These interpretations established Arminius as a symbol of national independence that transcended his specific historical context, creating cultural associations that would prove influential during subsequent periods of political development. The emergence of German nationalism during the 18th and 19th centuries transformed Arminius into Hermann the German, a mythical figure whose career embodied idealized concepts of Germanic racial superiority and national destiny that bore little resemblance to the complex historical realities of his actual life and political activities. Romantic historians and nationalist propagandists emphasized his role as defender of German racial purity against Roman cultural contamination, creating interpretations that reflected contemporary political objectives rather than historical understanding. These nationalist narratives ignored the internal Germanic political divisions that had ultimately led to his assassination, while presenting his resistance activities as evidence of inherent German military superiority over foreign enemies. The construction of the Hermannsdenkmal monument near Detmold between 1838 and 1875 represented the culmination of 19th century German nationalist appropriation of Arminius's historical legacy. The massive statue, standing 53.46 metres tall and depicting Hermann raising his sword toward France, symbolised German military power and national unity during the period of German unification under Prussian leadership. The monument's inscription, "German unity is my strength is Germany's power," reflected contemporary political aspirations rather than historical understanding of Arminius's actual career and objectives. The location near the presumed site of the Teutoburg forest battle created a pilgrimage destination that reinforced nationalist narratives about German historical destiny and military tradition. The political exploitation of Arminius's legacy during the Nazi period demonstrated the dangers of appropriating historical figures for ideological purposes that distort their actual significance and achievements. Nazi propagandists presented Hermann as a proto-Nazi leader whose racial consciousness and military genius prefigured 20th century German nationalism, creating historical narratives that served contemporary political objectives while ignoring the complex realities of ancient Germanic society and politics. These interpretations contributed to the militaristic and racial ideologies that characterized Nazi political culture, demonstrating how historical figures can be manipulated to support political movements that would have been incomprehensible to the individuals whose legacies are being exploited. The scholarly reassessment of Arminius's historical significance that began during the post-World War II period has attempted to separate legitimate historical analysis from the nationalist and ideological interpretations that had dominated previous scholarship. Modern historians emphasize his role as a political and military leader, operating within the specific context of Roman imperial expansion and Germanic tribal society, recognizing both his achievements and his limitations without imposing anachronistic concepts of nationalism or racial identity that had no relevance to ancient political structures. This approach has produced a more nuanced understanding of his career, while acknowledging the legitimate significance of his resistance activities for understanding the dynamics of imperial expansion and indigenous response. The permanent establishment of the Rhine as the Roman Germanic frontier represented perhaps Arminius's most enduring historical legacy, as his military and political activities created strategic realities that influenced European political development for centuries after his death. The failure of Roman expansion beyond the Rhine meant that Germanic tribal territories remained outside direct imperial control, preserving cultural and political institutions that would eventually contribute to the development of medieval European civilization. The linguistic, legal, and cultural differences between Romanized and Germanic territories that originated during this period continue to influence European political boundaries and cultural identities throughout the medieval and early modern periods. The broader impact on European history extended beyond immediate territorial considerations to include fundamental questions about the relationship between imperial expansion and indigenous resistance that would recur throughout subsequent centuries of European political development. Arminius's career demonstrated that technologically superior imperial forces could be defeated through coordinated indigenous resistance that exploited environmental advantages and political knowledge, providing strategic models that would influence resistance movements throughout European history. His example showed that successful resistance required not only military capability, but also political coordination that transcended traditional tribal or ethnic boundaries, lessons that remained relevant during subsequent periods of imperial expansion and indigenous response. The assessment of Arminius's enduring historical significance must acknowledge both his remarkable achievements and the tragic limitations that ultimately led to his downfall. His coordination of Germanic tribal resistance represented unprecedented political innovation that created military capabilities sufficient to defeat professional Roman armies and permanently alter imperial strategic planning. However, his inability to reconcile the demands of effective military leadership with traditional Germanic political institutions created internal tensions that proved as destructive as external Roman pressure. His career illustrates both the possibilities and the limitations of resistance leadership, demonstrating that military success alone cannot guarantee political survival without corresponding adaptation of institutional structures that can sustain coordinated action over extended periods. The transformation of Arminius from historical figure to cultural symbol reflects the enduring human fascination with individuals who challenge seemingly insurmountable odds while defending their communities against foreign domination. His story continues to resonate because it addresses fundamental questions about the relationship between individual leadership and collective action, the costs of resistance versus accommodation, and the tragic tensions between effective leadership and democratic institutions that remain relevant to contemporary political experience. The complexity of his legacy serves as a reminder that historical figures cannot be reduced to simple heroic or villainous categories, but must be understood within the specific context that shaped their choices and limited their options. In death, Arminius achieved the immortality that had eluded him in life, becoming a symbol of resistance whose significance transcended the specific circumstances of Roman-Germanic conflict to address universal themes of freedom, leadership, and the price of independence. His legacy reminds us that the struggle against domination requires not only courage and military skill, but also the wisdom to balance effective leadership with respect for the institutions and values that make freedom worth defending. The Germanic liberator's ultimate tragedy was not his assassination, but his inability to preserve the democratic traditions he had fought to protect from Roman imperial control.